Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we're traveling to the misty marshlands of northern Florida, where the cypress trees cast long shadows across Lake Seminole, and where a story of friendship, betrayal, and murder would unfold over 17 long years. This is the story of Mike Williams, a 31-year-old real estate appraiser who loved duck hunting, his young daughter, and trusted his best friend with his life. It's a story that begins on a cold December morning in 2000, when Mike set out for what he thought would be a peaceful hunting trip, but instead walked into a carefully orchestrated trap that would cost him everything. What makes this case particularly haunting isn't just the crime itself, but the web of deception that followed, a web so intricate that it would take nearly 2 decades to unravel. It's a story of a mother who refused to give up, investigators who wouldn't let go, and secrets that eventually found their way to the surface. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me tell you about the disappearance and murder of Mike Williams, a case that proves sometimes the people closest to us are the ones we should fear the most. To understand this story, we need to go back to the beginning, to understand who Mike Williams was, and the life he had built in Tallahassee, Florida. Jerry Michael Williams, Mike to his friends, was the kind of man who seemed to have it all figured out. Born and raised in Florida, he had that easy southern charm that made people gravitate toward him. He was tall, athletic, with a smile that could light up a room. Mike worked as a real estate appraiser, a job that suited his methodical nature and attention to detail. In 1994, Mike married Denise Merrill, a woman he had known since they were teenagers. Denise was beautiful, religious, and seemed to share Mike's vision of a traditional family life. They were both active in their local Baptist church, and their relationship appeared to be built on shared values and faith. By 2000, Mike and Denise had been married for 6 years. They lived in a comfortable home in Tallahassee, and Mike had become a successful real estate appraiser. Their daughter, Ansley, was just 18 months old, a beautiful little girl who was the apple of her father's eye. Mike was an outdoorsman at heart. He loved fishing, but his real passion was duck hunting. Every hunting season, he would spend hours in the marshes and wetlands around North Florida, often at Lake Seminole, a vast body of water that straddles the Florida-Georgia border. It was the perfect place for duck hunting, remote, wild, and filled with the kind of waterfowl that made for excellent hunting. But Mike wasn't a solitary hunter. He had a best friend who shared his passion for the outdoors, Brian Winchester. Brian was a successful insurance agent, a few years older than Mike, and they had been friends for years. They were practically inseparable, often spending weekends together hunting, fishing, or just hanging out. Brian was like a brother to Mike, and Mike trusted him completely. Brian was also married, to a woman named Kathy, and on the surface, both couples seemed to have everything they could want. They were young, successful, and their futures looked bright. But beneath this perfect facade, something was already beginning to rot. The truth was, by 2000, Mike and Denise's marriage was in trouble. They had been growing apart for years, and the spark that had once existed between them had dimmed. Mike, being the kind of man who believed in working through problems, was determined to save his marriage. He had no idea that his wife had already made other plans that involved his best friend and would ultimately cost him his life. While Mike Williams was working to save his marriage, his wife Denise and his best friend Brian Winchester were already deep into an affair that had been going on for years. The affair had begun in 1997, just 3 years into Mike and Denise's marriage. It started innocently enough. Brian and Denise had known each other through Mike, and they began talking more frequently. Brian would later describe it as something that just snowballed. One conversation led to another, one meeting led to another, and before they knew it, they were having a full-blown affair. What made this betrayal particularly cruel was how close Brian and Mike were. Brian wasn't just Denise's lover, he was Mike's best friend, the person Mike trusted most in the world outside of his family. When Mike needed someone to talk to about his marital problems, he turned to Brian. When he was worried about Denise's behavior, he confided in Brian. And all the while, Brian was the very person who was destroying Mike's marriage from the inside. The affair was conducted with careful precision. Brian and Denise would meet at hotels, sometimes even in the same town where Mike was working. They would coordinate their schedules so that they could be together when Mike was out of town on business. They became experts at deception, creating elaborate stories and alibis to cover their tracks. By 1999, the affair had evolved into something more serious. Brian and Denise weren't just having a physical relationship, they were planning a future together. But there was a problem: both were married, and both came from religious backgrounds where divorce was frowned upon. Denise's family, in particular, had strong religious convictions about the sanctity of marriage. This created a dilemma for the lovers. They wanted to be together, but they didn't want to face the social and religious consequences of divorce. They needed another solution, a solution that would allow them to be together without the stigma of being divorcees. And that's when they began to discuss the unthinkable: what if Mike were to die? The conversation started as hypothetical discussions. What would happen if Mike had an accident? What if he died unexpectedly? How would that change things for them? But gradually, these hypothetical conversations became more concrete. They began to talk about how Mike might die, when it might happen, and how they could make it look like an accident. Mike, meanwhile, was growing increasingly suspicious. He had noticed changes in Denise's behavior. She was distant, secretive, and seemed to be living a separate life. He had also noticed that she wasn't interested in physical intimacy with him anymore. These changes worried him, and he began to confide in his best friend Brian about his concerns. In a cruel twist of irony, Mike would often call Brian to talk about his worries about Denise. He would tell Brian that he thought his wife might be having an affair, and ask Brian's advice on what to do. Brian, playing the role of the concerned friend, would console Mike and offer suggestions on how to save the marriage, all while knowing that he was the very person who was destroying it. The psychological toll of this deception was enormous. Mike was dealing with the stress of a failing marriage, the worry about his daughter's future, and the confusion of not understanding why his wife had become so distant. He was a man who believed in honesty and loyalty, and he couldn't fathom that the two people he trusted most in the world were plotting against him. As 2000 progressed, the conversations between Brian and Denise became more specific. They began to discuss the details of how they might kill Mike and make it look like an accident. They talked about Mike's love of hunting and fishing, and how easy it would be for him to have an accident while out on the water. The plan they eventually settled on was diabolical in its simplicity. They would wait for duck hunting season, when Mike would be out on the water early in the morning, often alone. They would stage an accident that would make it look like Mike had fallen out of his boat and drowned. In the waters around Lake Seminole, with its alligators and remote location, it would be easy to believe that Mike's body had been consumed by wildlife or lost in the vast wetlands. But the plan wasn't just about murder, it was also about money. Mike had life insurance policies totaling $1.75 million, money that would go to Denise as his beneficiary. This wasn't just a crime of passion, it was a carefully calculated murder for financial gain. As the 2000 hunting season approached, Brian and Denise finalized their plan. They would wait for the right opportunity, when Mike was planning to go hunting alone. Brian would volunteer to go with him, and during the trip, he would kill his best friend and stage the scene to look like an accident. December 16, 2000, would be the day they put their plan into action. December 16, 2000, dawned cold and gray over Tallahassee, Florida. It was the kind of morning that duck hunters love, misty, quiet, with just enough chill in the air to make the ducks active. Mike Williams had been looking forward to this hunt for weeks. Mike woke up early that morning, as he always did when he was going hunting. He moved quietly through the house, trying not to wake Denise and 18-month-old Ansley. He gathered his gear, his shotgun, his hunting clothes, his calls, and all the other equipment that serious duck hunters consider essential. Before leaving, Mike did something that would later become significant to investigators. He called his best friend Brian Winchester and invited him to come along on the hunt. This wasn't unusual. Mike often invited Brian to join him, and they had shared many successful hunting trips together. But this time, Brian had already made his own plans. Brian declined the invitation, telling Mike that he had other commitments that day. What Mike didn't know was that Brian was lying. Brian had no other commitments. He was simply waiting for Mike to leave so that he could put the final phase of their murderous plan into motion. Mike kissed Denise goodbye and left the house around 5:30 a.m. He drove his truck to Lake Seminole, about 30 miles north of Tallahassee, pulling his small aluminum boat behind him. The lake was vast and sprawling, with countless coves and inlets that provided perfect habitat for waterfowl. Mike had been hunting these waters for years and knew them well. What Mike didn't know was that he was being followed. Brian Winchester had left his own house shortly after Mike, and was trailing him to the lake. The plan was simple. Brian would follow Mike to the boat launch, wait for him to get out on the water, and then implement the final phase of their plan. Mike arrived at the boat launch just as the sun was beginning to rise. He backed his truck and trailer down to the water's edge and prepared his boat for launch. It was a routine he had performed hundreds of times before, checking his equipment, making sure his motor was running properly, and loading his gear into the boat. The morning was perfect for duck hunting. The water was calm, there was a light mist hanging over the surface, and Mike could already hear the sounds of waterfowl in the distance. He launched his boat and headed out into the vast expanse of Lake Seminole, looking for the perfect spot to set up for the morning hunt. Meanwhile, Brian Winchester was putting his own boat into the water. He had followed Mike to the lake, and now he was tracking his best friend's movements, waiting for the right moment to strike. According to Brian's later confession, he followed Mike to a remote area of the lake, far from any other hunters or boat traffic. This was exactly what they had planned, a location where they could commit murder without any witnesses. The two men met up on the water, and from the outside, it looked like nothing more than two friends who had coincidentally ended up hunting in the same area. They talked for a while, discussing the hunting conditions and where they might find the best duck activity. To any observer, it would have seemed like a normal interaction between two experienced hunters. But Brian Winchester was not there to hunt ducks. He was there to kill his best friend. As they talked, Brian maneuvered his boat closer to Mike's. The plan was to make it look like an accident, specifically, to make it look like Mike had fallen out of his boat and drowned. In the cold December water, wearing heavy hunting clothes and boots, it would be easy to believe that Mike had been unable to swim to safety. What happened next would haunt Brian Winchester for the next 17 years. According to his confession, Mike became suspicious of Brian's behavior. Perhaps Mike noticed that Brian seemed nervous, or perhaps he picked up on some other signal that something was wrong. Mike began to question Brian about what he was doing there, and why he seemed so agitated. The conversation escalated quickly. Brian later described Mike as becoming panicked as he realized what was happening. Mike may have figured out that Brian was there to hurt him, or he may have simply realized that his best friend was not who he appeared to be. But Mike's realization came too late. Brian Winchester pulled out a shotgun, the same type of weapon that Mike had brought for duck hunting, and pointed it at his best friend. In that moment, Mike Williams must have experienced the ultimate betrayal. The person he trusted most in the world, the man he had confided in about his marital problems, the friend who had been like a brother to him, was now pointing a gun at him. Brian fired the shotgun, killing Mike Williams instantly. The man who had woken up that morning excited about a day of duck hunting, who had kissed his wife and daughter goodbye, who had been looking forward to a peaceful morning on the water, was dead. But the murder was only the beginning. Brian Winchester now had to cover up his crime and make it look like an accident. He had to transform a premeditated murder into what appeared to be a tragic hunting accident. Brian pushed Mike's boat away from the area where the murder had occurred. Then, he loaded Mike's body into his own boat and began the grim task of disposing of the evidence. He drove to a remote area near the lake, where he had already scouted out a location to bury the body. The spot Brian chose was perfect for concealing a crime. It was in a wooded area at the end of a dead-end road, miles from any houses or regular traffic. The ground was soft enough to dig, and the location was so remote that it was unlikely anyone would ever find it. Brian Winchester buried his best friend in this lonely spot, covering the grave carefully to make it look like undisturbed ground. Then, he returned to the lake to complete the staging of the accident. Brian pushed Mike's boat back out into the main part of the lake, where it would be easily found by search teams. He made sure that Mike's shotgun was in the boat, along with his other hunting gear, to make it look like Mike had been actively hunting when he disappeared. Then, Brian Winchester drove home, where he would begin the most challenging part of his crime, living with the secret of what he had done, and helping to comfort the woman he loved as she played the role of the grieving widow. The stage was set for one of the most elaborate cover-ups in Florida criminal history. But as Brian Winchester would learn over the next 17 years, some secrets are too heavy to carry forever. When Mike Williams failed to return from his hunting trip on December 16, 2000, his family initially wasn't too concerned. Mike was an experienced outdoorsman who sometimes stayed out later than expected if the hunting was good. But as the afternoon wore on and there was still no word from him, concern turned to worry, and worry turned to panic. Denise Williams called the authorities that evening to report her husband missing. She told them that Mike had left early that morning to go duck hunting on Lake Seminole, and that he was supposed to return by mid-afternoon. When he didn't come home, she had tried calling his cell phone, but there was no answer. The search began immediately. Lake Seminole is a vast body of water, more than 37,000 acres of open water, marshes, and wetlands that stretch across the Florida-Georgia border. Finding one person in such a vast area would be challenging under the best of circumstances, but in December, with short daylight hours and cold water, time was of the essence. Search teams found Mike's boat on the morning of December 17th. It was floating empty in the main channel of the lake, with Mike's shotgun, hunting gear, and other belongings still inside. The boat's motor was still running, which seemed to support the theory that Mike had somehow fallen overboard while the boat was in motion. The discovery of the boat triggered a massive search effort. Dozens of volunteers joined professional search teams, using boats, aircraft, and diving equipment to scour the lake and surrounding areas. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission coordinated the search, bringing in specialized equipment and experienced personnel. For days, the search continued. Divers explored the underwater areas around where the boat was found, looking for any sign of Mike's body. Aircraft flew grid patterns over the lake and surrounding wetlands, searching for any trace of the missing man. Volunteer boats spread out across the vast expanse of water, their crews scanning the surface for any clue. But Lake Seminole is known for more than just its excellent duck hunting. The lake is also home to a large population of alligators, some of them quite large. As the search continued with no sign of Mike's body, investigators began to consider the possibility that Mike had been attacked and consumed by alligators. This theory seemed to make sense. If Mike had fallen out of his boat in the cold water, wearing heavy hunting clothes and boots, he would have had difficulty swimming. If he had been injured in the fall, or if he had been in the water for an extended period, he would have been vulnerable to alligator attack. In the cold December water, even a strong swimmer like Mike might not have survived long enough to reach safety. After a week of intensive searching, the official search was called off. The authorities concluded that Mike Williams had likely drowned in Lake Seminole, and that his body had been consumed by alligators or lost in the vast wetlands surrounding the lake. It was a tragic but not uncommon occurrence in the waterways of North Florida. Denise Williams played the role of the grieving widow perfectly. She spoke to reporters about her husband's love of hunting and his experience on the water. She talked about how devoted he was to their daughter Ansley, and how much he would be missed. She appeared at search headquarters to coordinate with volunteers and thank them for their efforts. Brian Winchester also played his part. He appeared at the search efforts as Mike's best friend, helping to coordinate volunteers and offering support to Denise. He spoke about Mike's skill as a hunter and his knowledge of the lake, making it seem all the more tragic that such an experienced outdoorsman had met such a fate. But while the official search was called off, one person refused to give up: Mike's mother, Cheryl Williams. Cheryl Williams was a force of nature, a determined woman who knew her son better than anyone else. She had raised Mike to be careful and responsible, and she knew that he was an excellent swimmer and an experienced boater. The official explanation of his death just didn't make sense to her. Cheryl began conducting her own investigation. She hired a private investigator and consulted with experts on water safety and alligator behavior. What she learned convinced her that the official explanation was wrong. The private investigator she hired was a former law enforcement officer with extensive experience in water-related accidents. He examined the evidence from the search and concluded that something didn't add up. The location where Mike's boat was found, the condition of the boat, and the circumstances of the disappearance all raised questions in his mind. More importantly, Cheryl consulted with an alligator expert who told her something that would change everything. The expert explained that alligators are largely inactive in December due to the cold weather. They don't hunt actively in cold water, and they certainly don't consume entire human bodies without leaving any trace. If Mike had been killed by an alligator, there would have been some physical evidence: clothing, bones, or other remains. The expert's conclusion was definitive: Mike Williams had not been killed by an alligator. This revelation launched Cheryl Williams on a campaign that would last for years. She began pressuring law enforcement to reopen the investigation. She spoke to reporters, organized awareness campaigns, and refused to let anyone forget about her son's case. Cheryl's persistence began to pay off. In 2004, 4 years after Mike's disappearance, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement finally agreed to take another look at the case. They launched a multi-agency investigation, bringing in fresh eyes and new resources. The new investigation revealed several troubling inconsistencies in the original case. The location where Mike's boat was found seemed suspicious. It was in a heavily trafficked area of the lake, not the kind of remote spot where Mike usually hunted. The condition of the boat also raised questions. Everything was too neat, too organized, as if someone had carefully staged the scene. Investigators also began to take a closer look at the people in Mike's life. They interviewed his family, friends, and co-workers, looking for any clues that might have been missed in the original investigation. They examined his finances, his marriage, and his social relationships. What they found was a man who seemed to have been living a double life, or rather, a man who was unaware that the people closest to him were living double lives. The investigation revealed that Mike's marriage had been in serious trouble. Friends and family members reported that Mike had been worried about Denise's behavior and had suspected that she might be having an affair. Some people reported that Mike had even confronted Denise about his suspicions, but she had denied everything. More troubling was the discovery that Mike had recently purchased additional life insurance. The policies totaled $1.75 million, making Denise the beneficiary of a substantial sum in the event of Mike's death. But the most shocking discovery came when investigators began to look more closely at Mike's best friend, Brian Winchester. What they found was a man who seemed to have some very specific knowledge about Mike's disappearance, and who had been spending a lot of time with Mike's widow in the years since the disappearance. In fact, investigators learned that Brian Winchester and Denise Williams had been married in 2005, just 5 years after Mike's disappearance. The timing seemed suspicious: two grieving friends who had found comfort in each other, or two accomplices who had finally achieved their goal. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that Mike Williams' disappearance was not a tragic accident. It was something far more sinister, a carefully planned murder that had been covered up for years. But proving it would be another matter entirely. The investigators had no body, no physical evidence, and no witnesses. What they had was a web of suspicious circumstances and a growing conviction that Mike Williams had been betrayed by the two people he trusted most in the world. The case was about to take a dramatic turn. For more than a decade after Mike Williams' disappearance, Brian Winchester and Denise Williams appeared to be living the life they had dreamed of. They had married in 2005, combining their families and creating what seemed to be a perfect blended household. Brian's insurance business was thriving, and Denise was able to focus on raising Ansley, who had grown up believing that her father had died in a tragic accident. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect life, cracks were beginning to show. The weight of their shared secret was taking its toll on both Brian and Denise, and their marriage was not the fairy tale romance they had imagined it would be. Brian Winchester, in particular, was struggling with the psychological burden of what he had done. He had killed his best friend in cold blood, buried his body in a remote location, and then spent more than a decade living with the secret. The guilt was eating away at him, and he was beginning to show signs of the enormous stress he was under. Friends and family members noticed changes in Brian's behavior. He became more withdrawn, more prone to anger, and seemed to be struggling with depression. He began drinking more heavily, and his relationship with Denise became increasingly strained. Denise, meanwhile, was dealing with her own demons. She had achieved her goal of being with Brian and collecting on Mike's life insurance policies, but the reality of their life together was not what she had expected. The passion that had driven their affair seemed to have faded, replaced by the daily stress of living with their shared secret. The couple's relationship began to deteriorate seriously around 2010. They argued frequently, and Brian became increasingly controlling and possessive. Denise later told investigators that Brian had become paranoid, convinced that she was going to leave him or betray their secret. The situation reached a breaking point in 2012, when Denise finally decided that she wanted out of the marriage. She filed for divorce from Brian, citing irreconcilable differences. But Brian Winchester was not about to let her go easily. The divorce proceedings were bitter and contentious. Brian fought Denise on every issue, from property division to custody arrangements. He seemed determined to make the process as difficult as possible for her, and his behavior became increasingly erratic. During the divorce proceedings, Brian made several statements that would later prove to be significant. He repeatedly told friends and family members that Denise would never be able to leave him, because they were bound together by something that could never be undone. He also made several cryptic references to secrets that he and Denise shared, secrets that would destroy both of them if they ever came to light. As the divorce dragged on, Brian's behavior became more and more unstable. He began following Denise, showing up at her workplace and her home uninvited. He made threatening phone calls and sent angry text messages. Denise became increasingly frightened of her estranged husband, and she began to consider telling someone about what they had done to Mike Williams. The situation reached a crisis point on August 5, 2016. On that day, Brian Winchester's worst fears were realized. He became convinced that Denise was going to betray their secret and tell authorities about Mike's murder. According to court records, Brian armed himself with a shotgun and went to Denise's workplace. He waited for her to leave work, then forced her into his car at gunpoint. He drove her to a remote location, where he held her captive and threatened to kill her if she didn't agree to stay married to him. But Denise had had enough. She refused to be intimidated, and she fought back. During the struggle, she managed to get away from Brian and call for help. Brian Winchester was arrested and charged with kidnapping, a serious felony that carried a potential sentence of decades in prison. The arrest of Brian Winchester was the break that investigators had been waiting for. Here was a man who was clearly desperate and unstable, a man who had just committed a violent crime against the woman he claimed to love. It was exactly the kind of pressure that might cause someone to break and confess to a much more serious crime. Brian Winchester was sentenced to 20 years in prison for the kidnapping of Denise Williams. He was facing the rest of his life in prison, with no chance of parole for many years. It was a devastating fall from grace for a man who had once seemed to have everything. But the authorities were not finished with Brian Winchester. They knew that he held the key to solving the Mike Williams case, and they were determined to get him to talk. The pressure on Brian was immense. He was facing decades in prison, his marriage was over, his business was ruined, and his reputation was destroyed. He had lost everything, and he was looking at spending the rest of his life behind bars. More importantly, investigators had finally found the leverage they needed. Brian Winchester was a man who had always been concerned about his own well-being, and now he was facing the prospect of dying in prison. The authorities offered him a deal: if he would tell them the truth about what had happened to Mike Williams, they would consider giving him immunity from prosecution for the murder. For Brian Winchester, it was an offer he couldn't refuse. After 17 years of carrying the secret of Mike Williams' murder, he was finally ready to tell the truth. In October 2017, Brian Winchester made a full confession to investigators. He admitted that he had killed Mike Williams on December 16, 2000, and he told them where they could find Mike's body. He also implicated Denise Williams as his co-conspirator, revealing the full extent of their affair and their plan to murder Mike for his insurance money. The confession was incredibly detailed. Brian described how he had followed Mike to Lake Seminole that morning, how he had confronted his best friend on the water, and how he had shot him with a shotgun. He explained how he had buried Mike's body in a remote location, and how he had staged the scene to make it look like an accident. Most importantly, Brian led investigators to Mike Williams' body. On December 17, 2017, almost exactly 17 years after Mike's disappearance, his remains were found buried at the end of a dead-end road in Leon County, Florida, exactly where Brian Winchester said they would be. The discovery of Mike Williams' body was a watershed moment in the case. For the first time in 17 years, investigators had physical evidence of the crime. More importantly, they had a confession from one of the perpetrators and a clear motive for the murder. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement announced that Mike Williams had been the victim of a homicide, and that his case was now officially a murder investigation. The long-awaited answers that Cheryl Williams had been seeking for so many years were finally coming to light. But the case was far from over. Brian Winchester's confession had implicated Denise Williams as his co-conspirator, but she continued to maintain her innocence. The authorities now faced the challenge of proving that Mike's widow had been involved in planning his murder. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation in court, where the truth about Mike Williams' death would finally be revealed to the world. On May 8, 2018, nearly 18 years after Mike Williams' disappearance, Denise Williams was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory after the fact. The arrest came just months after Brian Winchester's confession and the discovery of Mike's body. The authorities had built their case carefully. They had Brian Winchester's detailed confession, which provided a roadmap of the crime from planning to execution. They had the physical evidence of Mike's body, which proved that he had been murdered rather than accidentally drowned. And they had a clear motive: the $1.75 million in life insurance policies that Denise had collected after Mike's death. But prosecuting Denise Williams would not be easy. Unlike Brian Winchester, she had not confessed to the crime. She continued to maintain her innocence, claiming that she had no knowledge of any plan to kill her husband. Her defense team argued that Brian Winchester was lying about her involvement, trying to blame her for a crime he had committed alone. The case that went to trial in December 2018 was a prosecutor's nightmare and a defense attorney's dream. The state's case rested almost entirely on the testimony of Brian Winchester, a man who had already admitted to committing murder and who had been given immunity in exchange for his testimony. The defense argued that Winchester was an unreliable witness who had every reason to lie about Denise's involvement. The trial began on December 10, 2018, in Leon County Circuit Court. The courtroom was packed with spectators, including Mike Williams' family, who had waited nearly 2 decades to see justice served. The case had garnered national attention, with news crews and true crime enthusiasts following every development. The prosecution's case was methodical and comprehensive. They presented evidence of the affair between Brian Winchester and Denise Williams, showing that it had begun in 1997 and had continued for years. They presented evidence of the couple's financial situation, showing that Denise had benefited significantly from Mike's death through the life insurance policies. Most dramatically, they presented Brian Winchester's confession in detail. Winchester took the stand and testified about every aspect of the crime, from the initial planning stages to the actual murder to the elaborate cover-up that followed. His testimony was devastating, painting a picture of a cold-blooded murder committed for love and money. Winchester testified that the idea to kill Mike had come from Denise. According to his testimony, she had been frustrated by her marriage and wanted to be with him, but she didn't want to face the social stigma of divorce. The life insurance money was an added incentive. It would allow them to start their new life together without financial worries. The prosecution also presented evidence about the couple's behavior after Mike's disappearance. They showed that Brian and Denise had continued their affair even while participating in the search for Mike's body. They had comforted each other during the grieving process, and they had married just 5 years after Mike's disappearance. Perhaps most damaging was evidence about Denise's behavior in the years following Mike's death. The prosecution showed that she had been eager to collect on the life insurance policies, and that she had shown little interest in the ongoing investigation into her husband's disappearance. When Mike's mother, Cheryl Williams, had pressed for further investigation, Denise had been resistant and uncooperative. The defense team, led by attorney Philip Padovano, fought back aggressively. They argued that there was no physical evidence linking Denise to the crime, no independent witnesses to any planning conversations, and no proof that she had been involved in any aspect of the murder. Padovano focused heavily on Brian Winchester's credibility, arguing that he was a desperate man who was willing to say anything to avoid spending the rest of his life in prison. He pointed out that Winchester had already demonstrated his willingness to lie and manipulate, and that his testimony should not be trusted. The defense also argued that the affair between Brian and Denise, while morally reprehensible, did not prove that she had been involved in murder. They suggested that Brian Winchester had killed Mike Williams on his own, possibly out of jealousy or some other personal motive, and that he was now trying to blame Denise to save himself. The trial lasted for 2 weeks, with both sides presenting compelling arguments. The jury heard testimony from dozens of witnesses, including family members, friends, investigators, and experts. One of the most powerful moments in the trial came when Cheryl Williams, Mike's mother, took the stand. She testified about her son's character, his love for his family, and his skill as an outdoorsman. She also testified about her nearly 2-decade fight to find the truth about what had happened to her son. Cheryl's testimony was emotional and compelling. She described how she had never believed the official explanation of Mike's disappearance, and how she had spent years fighting to get law enforcement to take another look at the case. She talked about the pain of losing her son and the additional pain of being told that she should accept that his death was an accident. The prosecution also presented evidence about the timing of various events in the case. They showed that Denise had been eager to have Mike increase his life insurance coverage in the months before his death, and that she had been quick to file claims after his disappearance. They also presented evidence about the couple's financial situation, showing that they had been struggling with debt and that the insurance money would have solved their problems. Perhaps most damaging was evidence about Denise's behavior during the investigation. The prosecution showed that she had been uncooperative with investigators, had refused to take polygraph tests, and had seemed more concerned about collecting insurance money than finding her husband's body. The defense countered with character witnesses who testified about Denise's reputation as a loving mother and devoted wife. They argued that she had been a victim of Brian Winchester's manipulation, and that she had been genuinely grieving for her husband. The defense also presented evidence suggesting that Brian Winchester had been obsessed with Denise and might have killed Mike out of jealousy, without her knowledge or consent. They argued that Winchester's testimony was self-serving and unreliable. On December 14, 2018, after deliberating for just over 8 hours, the jury reached their verdict. They found Denise Williams guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory after the fact. The verdict was met with tears and applause from Mike Williams' family and supporters. After nearly 18 years of fighting for justice, they had finally seen Mike's killer held accountable for her crimes. 2 months later, on February 6, 2019, Denise Williams was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge in the case, James Hankinson, said that the crime was particularly heinous because it involved the betrayal of trust between a husband and wife. Judge Hankinson noted that Denise had not only participated in planning her husband's murder, but had also spent years lying to investigators and to her own daughter about what had happened. He said that her actions had caused immeasurable pain to Mike's family and had denied them the opportunity to grieve properly. The sentencing brought a sense of closure to a case that had consumed the lives of everyone involved. Mike Williams' family finally had the justice they had sought for so many years, and his killer was behind bars where she belonged. But the case also raised troubling questions about the nature of trust, loyalty, and betrayal. Mike Williams had been killed by the two people he trusted most in the world, his wife and his best friend. His murder was not a crime of passion or a random act of violence, but a carefully planned execution carried out by people who claimed to love him. As we reach the end of Mike Williams' story, it's worth reflecting on the lessons this case teaches us about human nature, justice, and the price of betrayal. Mike Williams was, by all accounts, a good man. He was a loving father, a faithful husband, and a loyal friend. He worked hard, paid his taxes, went to church, and tried to live his life according to the values he had been taught. He trusted the people he loved, and he believed that they would never hurt him. In the end, that trust cost him his life. The case of Mike Williams is particularly tragic because it represents the ultimate betrayal of trust. Mike wasn't killed by a stranger or even by someone he barely knew. He was killed by his wife and his best friend, the two people in the world he trusted most completely. This betrayal was made even more cruel by the fact that it was carried out over a period of years. Denise Williams and Brian Winchester didn't just decide one day to kill Mike, they planned his murder carefully, discussing the details and preparing for the crime. They had numerous opportunities to change their minds, to confess their affair, or to simply walk away from their marriage and start over. Instead, they chose murder. The psychological impact of this betrayal cannot be overstated. Mike Williams spent the last months of his life worrying about his marriage, confiding in his best friend about his concerns, and trying to understand why his wife had become so distant. He was living in a world where nothing was as it seemed, where the people he trusted most were actively working against him. The case also highlights the corrosive effects of deception. Brian Winchester and Denise Williams began their relationship with lies and betrayal, and they continued to lie throughout their affair and after Mike's murder. The web of deception they created ultimately destroyed not just Mike's life, but their own lives as well. By the time their crimes were discovered, Brian Winchester was in prison, facing decades behind bars. Denise Williams was also in prison, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Their affair, which had begun as a passionate romance, had ultimately destroyed both of their lives. The case also had a devastating impact on the innocent victims, particularly Mike's daughter, Ansley. She grew up believing that her father had died in a tragic accident, only to learn as a teenager that he had actually been murdered by her mother and stepfather. The psychological trauma of this revelation is difficult to imagine. Mike's extended family also suffered enormously. His mother, Cheryl Williams, spent nearly 2 decades fighting for justice, sacrificing her own peace of mind and resources in the pursuit of truth. The case consumed her life, but her persistence ultimately led to justice being served. Perhaps most importantly, the case of Mike Williams demonstrates the importance of never giving up in the search for truth. The original investigation concluded that Mike had died in an accident, and many people were willing to accept that explanation. But Cheryl Williams knew her son, and she knew that something wasn't right about the official story. Her refusal to accept the easy answer, her persistence in pressing for further investigation, and her willingness to challenge authority ultimately led to the truth being revealed. Without her efforts, Mike's murder might never have been solved, and his killers might never have been brought to justice. The case also shows us that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still be served. It took nearly 18 years for Mike Williams' killers to be brought to trial, but eventually, the truth came to light. The physical evidence was discovered, confessions were obtained, and convictions were secured. Today, Mike Williams rests in peace, his body finally laid to rest in a proper grave. His killers are in prison, where they will spend the rest of their lives. His family has the closure they sought for so many years. But the case of Mike Williams serves as a reminder that evil can hide behind the most innocent facades. The people who seem most trustworthy, most loyal, and most loving may be capable of the most heinous crimes. Trust, once broken, can never be fully repaired. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Mike Williams, a man who loved his family, trusted his friends, and paid the ultimate price for that trust. Remember his mother, Cheryl, who never gave up in her search for justice. And remember that sometimes, the most important battles are fought not with weapons or violence, but with persistence, determination, and an unwavering commitment to truth. The waters of Lake Seminole still lap against the shore where Mike Williams once hunted. The cypress trees still cast their shadows across the water. But the lake no longer holds the secret it kept for so many years. The truth has finally come to light, and justice has been served. Mike Williams can finally rest in peace. Please, if you're new here, welcome to our channel where we explore true crime stories in a calm, respectful manner. I want to use this opportunity to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Please, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight, we're traveling back to 2009, to the quiet town of Plainville, Connecticut, where a young woman's desperate cries for help went unheard until it was too late. This is the story of Tiana Notice, a 25-year-old graduate student whose life was cut tragically short on Valentine's Day by the very person she had repeatedly warned authorities about. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story contains themes of domestic violence and stalking. Tiana's story is not just about her tragic end, but about the systematic failures that allowed a dangerous man to continue terrorizing her despite her numerous attempts to seek help through proper channels. Tiana Angelique Notice was born into a loving family who would later become fierce advocates for domestic violence victims. She was pursuing her graduate degree at the University of Hartford, building a future that seemed bright and promising. Like many young women in the digital age, she turned to online dating to find companionship. What she found instead was a nightmare that would ultimately cost her life. This case would later inspire significant changes to Connecticut's domestic violence laws, but those changes came too late for Tiana. Her story serves as a stark reminder of how the system can fail those who need protection most. In 2008, Tiana Notice was a vibrant 24-year-old woman living in Plainville, Connecticut. She was intelligent, driven, and focused on her studies at the University of Hartford, where she was pursuing her graduate degree. Like many young professionals, she decided to try online dating, hoping to find someone who shared her ambitions and values. Through a dating website, Tiana met James Carter II. At first glance, Carter seemed like a promising match. He was articulate, charming, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know her. They began exchanging messages, and their conversations flowed naturally. Carter presented himself as a stable, working man in the insurance industry, someone who had his life together. Their first few dates went well. Carter was attentive and seemed to genuinely care about Tiana's goals and dreams. He listened when she talked about her studies, her family, and her aspirations for the future. To Tiana, he appeared to be exactly the kind of partner she was looking for, someone who would support her ambitions while building a life together. As their relationship progressed, Tiana began spending more time with Carter. She introduced him to her family, including her father, Alvin Notice, who had always been protective of his daughter. From the beginning, Alvin had reservations about Carter. There was something about the man that didn't sit right with him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Tiana's father later recalled sensing that something was off about Carter during their first meeting. There was something about his eyes, he would later tell investigators. Something that made me uncomfortable. But Tiana seemed happy, and Alvin didn't want to interfere in his daughter's relationship based solely on a gut feeling. For the first 6 months of their relationship, things seemed relatively normal. Carter was attentive, perhaps even overly so. He would frequently check in with Tiana throughout the day, wanting to know where she was and what she was doing. At first, Tiana interpreted this as caring concern. She appreciated having someone who was so interested in her daily life. But as time went on, Carter's attention began to feel more like surveillance than affection. He would become upset if Tiana didn't respond to his messages immediately. He would question her about her whereabouts and become suspicious if she spent time with friends or classmates. The caring boyfriend was slowly revealing himself to be someone much more controlling and possessive. 6 months into their relationship, Tiana's world was shattered by a revelation that would change everything. Carter had been sentenced to 5 months in jail for the domestic abuse of a previous girlfriend. This was not something he had voluntarily shared with Tiana, she discovered it through other means, and the discovery left her reeling. The news hit Tiana like a physical blow. The man she had been dating, the man she had trusted and cared for, had a history of violence against women. But this was just the beginning of what she would learn about James Carter too. As she began to investigate further, she discovered that Carter's criminal history was extensive and deeply troubling. Carter had a long history of violent crimes, including multiple assault charges. He had been in and out of the legal system for years, leaving a trail of victims in his wake. The charming, attentive man who had swept Tiana off her feet was, in reality, a predator who had been perfecting his methods for years. But the revelations didn't stop there. Tiana also began to suspect that Carter was cheating on her. She had noticed inconsistencies in his stories about where he had been and what he had been doing. Phone calls that were quickly ended when she entered the room. Secretive behavior that hadn't been there at the beginning of their relationship. Her father, Alvin, had also noticed changes in Carter's behavior. "I could see that he was becoming more controlling," Alvin would later recall. He didn't want Tiana to have friends or spend time with her family. He wanted to isolate her, to make her dependent on him. The combination of discovering Carter's violent past and her suspicions about his infidelity created a perfect storm of realization for Tiana. She began to understand that the man she had fallen for was not who he claimed to be. The careful facade he had maintained for the first 6 months of their relationship was crumbling, revealing the dangerous individual beneath. Tiana began to fear for her safety. She had seen firsthand how Carter's temper could flare, how quickly his mood could shift from charming to threatening. She had witnessed his jealousy and possessiveness, and now she understood that these weren't just personality quirks, they were warning signs of a dangerous man. The process of learning about Carter's true nature was gradual and terrifying. Each new piece of information painted a clearer picture of the man she had been involved with. She realized that she had been carefully manipulated and that the relationship she thought she was in was built on lies and deception. As Tiana processed these revelations, she began to understand that she needed to end the relationship. But she also understood that breaking up with Carter would not be simple or safe. Given his history of violence and his increasingly controlling behavior, she knew that leaving him could be dangerous. She began to plan her exit strategy carefully. She confided in her family about what she had learned and started documenting Carter's behavior. She kept records of his controlling actions, his threats, and his attempts to isolate her from her support system. The decision to leave Carter was not made lightly. Tiana understood the risks involved, but she also understood that staying with him was not an option. She had seen what he was capable of, and she refused to become another victim of his violence. In December 2008, Tiana made the difficult but necessary decision to end her relationship with James Carter II. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, knowing that it would not be easy and that Carter would not take the news well. She had seen his temper, witnessed his need for control, and understood that he would not simply accept her decision to leave. The breakup itself was as difficult as Tiana had anticipated. Carter became immediately defensive and then angry when she explained that she wanted to end their relationship. He demanded explanations, refused to accept her decision, and insisted that they could work through whatever problems she perceived in their relationship. Tiana remained firm in her decision, despite Carter's attempts to manipulate her into staying. She had made up her mind, and she was not going to be swayed by his promises to change or his claims that he couldn't live without her. She had heard these promises before, and she had seen enough of his true nature to know that they were hollow. Carter's reaction to the breakup was immediate and intense. Rather than accepting Tiana's decision and moving on, he became obsessed with winning her back. He began showing up at her apartment building, sitting in his car for hours, watching her windows and monitoring her comings and goings. At first, Tiana tried to ignore Carter's behavior. She hoped that if she didn't respond to his attempts to contact her, he would eventually give up and move on. But Carter's behavior only escalated. He began following her when she left her apartment, maintaining a distance but making sure she knew he was there. The stalking behavior was psychological torture for Tiana. She never knew when she might see Carter's car parked outside her building or catch a glimpse of him following her to work or the grocery store. The constant surveillance made her feel like a prisoner in her own life. When Tiana finally confronted Carter about his stalking behavior, his response was both shocking and revealing. Rather than apologizing or agreeing to leave her alone, Carter became enraged. He accused Tiana of assaulting him during their confrontation and took out a restraining order against her. This was a classic abuser tactic, reversing the roles of victim and perpetrator. Carter, who had been stalking and harassing Tiana, was now claiming that she was the aggressor. The restraining order was his way of maintaining control over the situation while simultaneously painting himself as the victim. Tiana was stunned by Carter's actions. She had never assaulted him, and she knew that his claims were false. But she also understood that fighting the restraining order would be difficult and time-consuming. She decided to comply with the order, hoping that this would finally put an end to Carter's harassment. But Carter's obtaining a restraining order against Tiana was not the end of his harassment, it was just the beginning of a new phase. Having painted himself as the victim, he now felt justified in continuing to monitor and harass her. He began sending her threatening emails, each one more menacing than the last. The emails were psychologically devastating. Carter wrote messages like, "As God is my witness, punishment is on the way, so be prepared," and, "You will have bad luck, you hear me? Remember this email when karma bites you in the ass." These messages were clearly designed to intimidate and frighten Tiana, and they succeeded in doing exactly that. With the threatening emails piling up in her inbox, Tiana knew she needed help. She gathered the evidence of Carter's violations of the restraining order and went to the police. This should have been the moment when the system worked to protect her, when the authorities took action against a man who was clearly violating a court order and threatening his ex-girlfriend. Instead, Tiana was met with indifference and dismissal. The police officers who reviewed Carter's emails told her that they were non-threatening. They saw no reason to take action against Carter, despite the clear violations of the restraining order. This response was devastating for Tiana, who had hoped that law enforcement would protect her from her dangerous ex-boyfriend. The police's failure to take action was the first in a series of system failures that would ultimately cost Tiana her life. Their dismissal of her concern sent a clear message to both Tiana and Carter: his behavior was acceptable, and there would be no consequences for his actions. Emboldened by the police's inaction, Carter escalated his harassment campaign. He began calling Tiana repeatedly, sometimes dozens of times in a single day. He would call her at work, at home, and on her cell phone. Each call was another violation of the restraining order, but Carter had learned that there would be no consequences for his actions. Tiana continued to document every incident of harassment and continued to report Carter's violations to the police. According to her mother, Tiana went to the police 33 times in a 6-week period, desperately seeking help and protection. Each time, she was told that there was nothing the police could do, that Carter's actions didn't rise to the level of criminal behavior. The constant harassment was taking a severe toll on Tiana's mental and physical health. She was living in a state of constant fear, never knowing when Carter might call or show up. She was struggling to focus on her studies and her work, and she was becoming increasingly isolated as she tried to avoid situations where Carter might find her. The police's continued inaction was particularly frustrating because Tiana was doing everything right. She was documenting the harassment, reporting every incident, and providing clear evidence of Carter's violations of the restraining order. She was following all the proper procedures, but the system was failing her at every turn. One morning, Tiana discovered that her car had been vandalized. The damage was extensive and clearly intentional. Tiana immediately suspected Carter and reported the incident to the police. Once again, she was told that there was nothing they could do because they had no proof that Carter was responsible for the vandalism. This response was particularly galling because Carter had been systematically harassing Tiana for weeks. The vandalism was clearly part of his campaign of intimidation, but the police treated it as an isolated incident rather than part of a pattern of escalating behavior. The vandalism of her car was a turning point for Tiana. She realized that the police were not going to help her, and that she needed to take additional steps to protect herself. She began to fear for her life, understanding that Carter's behavior was escalating and that he was becoming increasingly dangerous. Tiana's family was also becoming increasingly concerned about her safety. They could see the toll that Carter's harassment was taking on her, and they were frustrated by the police's continued inaction. They began to discuss alternative ways to protect Tiana and gather evidence against Carter. The failure of the police to take action against Carter was not just a failure to protect Tiana, it was a failure to enforce the law. Carter was clearly violating the restraining order, but the police were choosing to ignore his violations. This sent a message that restraining orders were meaningless pieces of paper that would not be enforced. For Tiana, the police's inaction was not just frustrating, it was terrifying. She understood that she was essentially on her own, that the system that was supposed to protect her was failing her in the most fundamental way. She was a law-abiding citizen who was being stalked and harassed by a dangerous man, but the authorities were refusing to help her. The psychological impact of this abandonment by the system cannot be overstated. Tiana was not just dealing with the stress of being stalked, she was dealing with the realization that the institutions she had trusted to protect her were failing her. This double trauma would have a lasting impact on her mental health and her ability to cope with Carter's ongoing harassment. Realizing that the police would not help her, Tiana and her family decided to take matters into their own hands. Her father, Alvin Notice, was particularly frustrated by the authorities' failure to protect his daughter. He had watched as Tiana went to the police again and again, only to be turned away each time. He was not going to stand by and watch his daughter be terrorized while the police did nothing. Alvin helped Tiana install a surveillance camera in her apartment building's parking lot. The camera was positioned to capture anyone who entered the building or approached Tiana's car. This was their way of gathering evidence that the police seemed unwilling to collect themselves. The installation of the camera was both a practical and symbolic act. Practically, it would provide evidence of Carter's continued harassment and stalking. Symbolically, it represented the family's determination to protect Tiana when the system had failed to do so. The camera gave Tiana and her family a small measure of comfort. They knew that if Carter continued to harass her, they would have video evidence of his actions. This evidence could potentially be used to force the police to take action, or it could be used in court proceedings against Carter. But the camera also served as a reminder of how alone Tiana was in her fight against Carter. The fact that a young woman and her family had to install their own surveillance equipment to protect themselves from a stalker was a damning indictment of the system's failure to protect victims of domestic violence. The night after the camera was installed, Tiana returned home from work to find a handwritten note taped to her apartment door. The note read, "Tiana, forgive me. I never cheated on you. If I'm lying, may God take my life. Forgive me for everything else I have done." The note was clearly from Carter, and it represented another violation of the restraining order. But there was something particularly chilling about the handwritten message. It showed that Carter had been inside her apartment building, had approached her door, and had left a message for her. It was a clear demonstration that he could reach her whenever he wanted to. The note was also psychologically manipulative. Rather than apologizing for his harassment and stalking, Carter was attempting to rewrite history. He was claiming that he had never cheated on Tiana and asking for forgiveness for unspecified actions. This was classic abuser behavior, minimizing his actions while attempting to manipulate his victim into feeling sorry for him. Unfortunately, the surveillance camera had run out of tape before Carter left the note. This meant that while they had evidence of his violation of the restraining order, they didn't have video evidence of him entering the building or approaching Tiana's door. It was a frustrating near miss that highlighted the challenges of gathering evidence against a determined stalker. However, the handwritten note finally prompted the police to take some action. They agreed to contact Carter and ask him to provide a handwriting sample that could be compared to the note. This was the first concrete step the police had taken in weeks of harassment reports. The handwriting sample request was a small victory for Tiana, but it was also a source of anxiety. She knew that Carter would be furious when he learned that she had once again reported him to the police. She had seen his anger before, and she knew that he would likely retaliate in some way. Tiana's fears were well-founded. Carter was indeed enraged when the police contacted him about the handwriting sample. He saw this as another betrayal by Tiana, another attempt to get him in trouble. His anger was building to a dangerous level, and he was beginning to plan his revenge. The police request for a handwriting sample was the final straw for James Carter too. He had been escalating his harassment of Tiana for weeks, and each time the police had failed to take meaningful action. But now they were asking for evidence that could potentially be used against him in court. Carter interpreted this as a direct threat, and his response would be swift and deadly. February 14, 2009, was Valentine's Day. For most people, it was a day of love and romance. For Tiana Notice, it would be the last day of her life. She had no way of knowing that as she went about her normal routine that day, Carter was planning his final, most violent act of revenge. Carter spent the day preparing for what he had decided would be his ultimate response to Tiana's attempts to get him in trouble with the police. He had reached a point where he believed that if he couldn't have Tiana, then no one could. This mindset, that his ex-girlfriend was his property to control or destroy, is unfortunately common among men who kill their intimate partners. As evening approached, Carter made his way to Tiana's apartment complex. He knew her schedule, knew when she would be coming home from work. He had spent so much time stalking her that he knew her routines better than she did. He positioned himself where he could watch for her arrival, and he waited. Tiana returned home from work that evening with no idea of the danger that awaited her. She had been living in fear for weeks, but she had no reason to believe that this particular night would be different from any other. She parked her car in the parking lot where her father had installed the surveillance camera, and she began walking toward her apartment building. Carter had been waiting for this moment. As Tiana approached her building, he emerged from his hiding place and confronted her. What happened next was the culmination of weeks of escalating harassment and threats. Carter, armed with a knife, launched a vicious attack on his ex-girlfriend. The attack was brutal and sustained. Carter stabbed Tiana multiple times, continuing the assault even as she tried to defend herself and escape. The attack was not just an attempt to hurt her, it was an attempt to kill her. Carter had decided that if he couldn't control Tiana, he would destroy her. The surveillance camera that Tiana's father had installed captured the audio of the attack. The sounds of the struggle, Tiana's screams, and the violence of the assault were all recorded. This audio would later be used as evidence in Carter's trial, providing a horrifying soundtrack to his crime. Despite the severity of her injuries, Tiana was still conscious when Carter fled the scene. She was bleeding heavily from multiple stab wounds, but she was still alive. In what would be her final act of courage, she managed to call 911 to report the attack. The 911 call was heartbreaking. Tiana, barely conscious and bleeding to death, managed to tell the dispatcher, "I'm bleeding to death. My ex-boyfriend just stabbed me to death." Even in her final moments, she was trying to ensure that her attacker would be identified and brought to justice. The 911 call was also crucial evidence in the case against Carter. It clearly identified him as the attacker and provided a timeline for the assault. Tiana's final words would become key evidence in ensuring that her killer was held accountable for his crime. Paramedics arrived at the scene within minutes of Tiana's call, but the damage was too severe. She had been stabbed approximately 20 times, and she had lost a massive amount of blood. The paramedics worked frantically to save her life, but her injuries were too extensive. Tiana Notice was rushed to Hartford Hospital, where doctors worked desperately to save her life. She had lost a tremendous amount of blood and had suffered injuries to multiple vital organs. The medical team did everything they could, but the damage inflicted by Carter's attack was too severe. 2 hours after the attack, Tiana Notice was pronounced dead at Hartford Hospital. She was just 25 years old, a graduate student with her whole life ahead of her. Her death was the tragic culmination of a months-long campaign of harassment and stalking that the authorities had failed to stop. The news of Tiana's death devastated her family and friends. Her father, Alvin Notice, was particularly grief-stricken. He had tried to protect his daughter, had helped her install surveillance equipment, and had supported her efforts to get help from the police. But despite all of their efforts, the system had failed them in the most fundamental way. The investigation into Tiana's murder was swift and straightforward. The 911 call had clearly identified Carter as the attacker, and the surveillance camera had captured the audio of the assault. There was no question about who had killed Tiana Notice, the only question was whether he would be held accountable for his crime. Carter was arrested shortly after the attack. He had fled the scene but made no serious attempt to evade capture. He was found and taken into custody without incident. The evidence against him was overwhelming: Tiana's identification of him as her attacker, the audio recording of the assault, and the documented history of harassment and stalking. The arrest of Carter was a small measure of justice for Tiana's family, but it could not bring her back. They had lost a daughter, a sister, and a friend to a man who had been terrorizing her for months. The fact that Carter was finally in custody was cold comfort to a family devastated by loss. The case against Carter was strong, but the legal process would take time. In the meantime, Tiana's family began the difficult process of grieving their loss while also advocating for changes to the system that had failed to protect her. They were determined that Tiana's death would not be in vain, that it would lead to changes that would protect other women from similar fates. The media coverage of Tiana's case brought attention to the broader issue of domestic violence and the failures of the criminal justice system to protect victims. Her story became a rallying cry for advocates who had been fighting for stronger domestic violence laws and better training for police officers. Tiana's family established the Tiana Angelique Notice Foundation to honor her memory and to advocate for domestic violence victims. The foundation worked to educate the public about the warning signs of domestic violence and to push for legal reforms that would better protect victims. The foundation's work was part of a broader movement to address the systemic failures that had contributed to Tiana's death. Advocates pointed to her case as an example of how restraining orders could be meaningless without proper enforcement, and how police departments needed better training to recognize and respond to domestic violence situations. The legal proceedings against Carter would take nearly 3 years to complete. During that time, Tiana's family worked tirelessly to ensure that her killer would be held accountable and that her death would lead to meaningful changes in how domestic violence cases are handled. James Carter II's trial began in 2011, nearly 2 years after he murdered Tiana Notice. The prosecution's case was strong, built on the foundation of Tiana's own 911 call, the surveillance audio, and the documented history of harassment and stalking. The evidence painted a clear picture of a man who had escalated from harassment to murder when he couldn't control his ex-girlfriend. The trial was emotionally difficult for Tiana's family, who had to relive the horror of her final months and the night of her death. But they were determined to see justice done and to ensure that Carter received the punishment he deserved for his crime. The jury deliberated for a relatively short time before returning a guilty verdict. Carter was found guilty of murder and of violating the restraining order. The verdict was a victory for Tiana's family and for domestic violence advocates who had followed the case closely. On January 13, 2012, Carter was sentenced to 60 years in prison. The sentence was appropriate given the severity of his crime, but it was also a stark reminder of the life that had been lost. Carter, who had chosen not to attend his sentencing hearing, showed no remorse for his actions. Tiana's father, Alvin Notice, spoke at the sentencing hearing about his daughter's life and the impact of her death. He noted that Carter's absence from the hearing demonstrated his lack of remorse and his continuing selfishness. If a person was remorseful, he'd be out there saying to the family, "I apologize. This guy's an evil person and he deserves what he's getting." But the criminal conviction was only part of the justice that Tiana's family sought. In 2011, they filed a civil lawsuit against the police officers who had failed to protect Tiana despite her repeated requests for help. The lawsuit alleged that the officers had been negligent in their handling of Tiana's complaints and that their inaction had contributed to her death. The civil trial was a significant moment in the broader conversation about police accountability and domestic violence. It put the spotlight on the specific failures that had allowed Carter to continue his harassment campaign despite multiple violations of the restraining order. In 2014, a jury awarded Tiana's estate $10 million in the wrongful death lawsuit, finding that the police officers had indeed been negligent in their handling of her case. The verdict was a vindication of the family's claims and a powerful statement about the importance of taking domestic violence seriously. The $10 million award was significant not just for its size, but for what it represented. It was a recognition that the system had failed Tiana Notice and that there were consequences for that failure. It sent a message to law enforcement agencies that they would be held accountable for their failures to protect domestic violence victims. Beyond the legal victories, Tiana's case led to meaningful changes in Connecticut's domestic violence laws. The case spurred stronger domestic violence laws in the state, including better training for police officers and improved procedures for handling domestic violence cases. Today, Tiana's legacy lives on through the foundation established in her name and through the legal changes that her case helped to bring about. While her death was a tragedy that could and should have been prevented, her story has helped to protect other women from similar fates. The murder of Tiana Notice serves as a stark reminder of the deadly consequences of domestic violence and the importance of taking threats seriously. Her story is a call to action for all of us to recognize the warning signs of domestic violence and to support victims in their efforts to escape dangerous situations. As we close this story, we remember Tiana Notice not just as a victim, but as a young woman who had dreams and aspirations, who was loved by her family and friends, and whose life had value and meaning. Her death was a tragedy, but her legacy continues to make a difference in the fight against domestic violence. Please, if you're enjoying this stories, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight, we're going to explore a case that shook the small communities of Winter Haven, Florida, and Savannah, Georgia. It's a story that reveals the darkest corners of human nature, where a father's desperate attempts to cover up one tragedy led to an even more heinous crime. This is the story of 29-year-old Ronkia Holmes and her precious 3-year-old daughter, Masera Ross. It's a case that involves deception, manipulation, and ultimately, the complete breakdown of trust between two people who should have been working together for the sake of their child. Their story needs to be told, not for sensationalism, but as a reminder of the precious lives that were lost and the importance of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Let's begin our journey into this tragic case, one that would remain hidden for over a year before the truth finally came to light. Our story begins with Ronkia Holmes, a 29-year-old woman from Savannah, Georgia, who was working hard to build a better life for herself and her daughter. Ronkia was attending technical college, determined to gain the skills she needed to provide for her family. She was described by those who knew her as a dedicated mother who would do anything for her child. Then there was little Masera Ross, just 3 years old, with her whole life ahead of her. Masera was the product of a relationship between Ronkia and a man named Lester Ross Jr. Like many modern families, Ronkia and Lester weren't together, but they had worked out a custody arrangement that seemed to be in everyone's best interest. Lester Ross Jr. was a 34-year-old man living in Haines City, Florida, near Winter Haven. He was married to a woman named Sharon Ross, and together they had agreed to care for Masera while Ronkia focused on completing her education. This arrangement wasn't uncommon. Many separated parents work out similar custody agreements, trusting that their child will be safe and loved in the other parent's care. Sharon Ross, Lester's wife, became an integral part of this family dynamic. She had agreed to help care for Masera, taking on the role of stepmother. From the outside, this might have seemed like a functional, if complicated, family arrangement. Ronkia could focus on her studies in Georgia, knowing that Masera was being cared for by her father and stepmother in Florida. But as we'll discover, not everything was as it seemed in this household. The trust that Ronkia had placed in Lester, the fundamental trust that any parent has when they leave their child with the other parent, would prove to be tragically misplaced. The stage was set for a series of events that would ultimately destroy this family completely, leaving 2 innocent people dead and a community struggling to understand how something so horrific could happen. To understand the full scope of this case, we need to go back to May 2009, several months before Ronkia's death. It was during this time that the first tragedy occurred, setting in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to even greater horror. According to Sharon Ross's later testimony to police, she had left Masera alone with Lester while she went out. When she returned home, she discovered something that would haunt her for the rest of her life: little Masera was dead. Sharon would later tell investigators that when she found Masera, Lester claimed it was an accident. The exact details of what happened to the 3-year-old girl remain unclear, but what we do know is that instead of calling 911, instead of contacting authorities, instead of doing what any normal person would do in such a situation, Lester made a decision that defies comprehension. He told Sharon that they couldn't report Masera's death. Whatever had happened, he convinced his wife that they needed to keep it secret. And then, in what can only be described as an act of absolute horror, Lester placed his daughter's body in their deep freezer. Think about that for a moment. A 3-year-old child, who should have been running around, playing, laughing, learning about the world around her, her small body was wrapped up and placed in a freezer like she was nothing more than a piece of meat to be preserved. Sharon Ross would later testify that she knew this was wrong, that she knew they should have called the police, but she said she was afraid of Lester. She described him as controlling and threatening, someone who had made it clear that she needed to keep quiet about what had happened. For months, from May 2009 through October 2009, Masera's body remained in that freezer. Every day, Sharon and Lester went about their lives, eating meals, watching television, sleeping, all while a dead child lay frozen just steps away in their kitchen. Meanwhile, in Savannah, Georgia, Ronkia Holmes had no idea that her daughter was dead. She was continuing her studies, working toward her degree, probably thinking about Masera every day, wondering how she was doing, looking forward to their next visit. She trusted that Masera was safe with her father. Lester maintained this deception for months. When Ronkia would call to check on Masera, he would make excuses for why she couldn't talk to her daughter. Maybe Masera was napping, or playing outside, or at a friend's house. He became skilled at coming up with reasons why mother and daughter couldn't speak. This level of deception requires a particular kind of coldness, a complete lack of empathy not just for the child who had died, but for the mother who was being kept in the dark about her daughter's fate. Every conversation with Rankia was a lie, every reassurance about Masera's well-being was a cruel manipulation. As the months passed, the deception became harder to maintain. Rankia was completing her technical program and would soon want to be reunited with her daughter. The day of reckoning was approaching, and Lester Ross knew it. October 2009 marked the beginning of what should have been a joyful time for Rankia Holmes. She was nearing completion of her technical college program and was ready to be reunited with her daughter. She had been patient, sacrificing time with Masera so that she could build a better future for both of them. On October 14, 2009, Rankia made the journey from Savannah, Georgia, to Winter Haven, Florida. It was a trip she had made before, but this time it was meant to be different. This time, she was planning to take Masera home with her. She had arranged to stay in Florida for a few days to spend time with her daughter before they returned to Georgia together. Imagine Rankia's excitement during that drive. She was probably thinking about all the things she wanted to do with Masera, all the catching up they had to do. She might have brought gifts, or planned special activities. She was a mother who had been separated from her child for months, and now she was finally going to be reunited with her. But when Rankia arrived in Winter Haven, things weren't quite right. Lester kept making excuses about why she couldn't see Masera immediately. He would say the child was sleeping, or that she was at a relative's house, or that she was feeling a bit under the weather. Each excuse probably seemed reasonable on its own, but together they formed a pattern of delay and deception. For 4 days, from October 14 through October 17, Rankia stayed in Florida, growing increasingly frustrated and concerned. She had come all this way to see her daughter, and Lester kept putting her off. Phone calls and text messages between them during this period likely became increasingly tense as Rankia demanded to know why she couldn't see Masera. During these 4 days, Lester was probably frantically trying to figure out what to do. He had been living with the secret of Masera's death for months, but now he was facing the reality that he couldn't keep that secret much longer. Rankia wasn't going to leave Florida without her daughter, and he couldn't produce a living child who had been dead for months. On October 18, 2009, Rankia called her family members back in Georgia. She told them that she was finally going to meet Lester at a Walmart to pick up Masera. She mentioned that she was having difficulties with Lester, that he was being evasive and uncooperative, but she was determined to get her daughter and bring her home. This phone call would be the last time Rankia's family would hear from her alive. She was about to walk into a trap that had been months in the making, set by a man who had already killed once and was now prepared to kill again to protect his secret. The meeting at Walmart was never meant to be a custody exchange. Lester Ross had no intention of handing over a child who had been dead for months. Instead, he was planning to eliminate the one person who could expose his secret, Masera's mother. What happened next would only come to light years later, when Sharon Ross finally found the courage to testify about what she had witnessed. Her testimony would reveal the cold, calculated nature of Lester Ross's second murder, a murder that was committed not in a moment of passion or panic, but as a deliberate act to cover up his first crime. According to Sharon's testimony, Lester had been planning Rankia's murder for days. He knew that he couldn't keep making excuses about Masera's whereabouts, and he knew that Rankia wasn't going to leave Florida without her daughter. In his twisted mind, the solution was simple: if Rankia was dead, she couldn't ask any more questions about Masera. The method he chose was particularly insidious. Rather than using violence that might attract attention, Lester decided to use poison. He prepared a soft drink, accounts suggest it was either a Coca-Cola or similar soda, and laced it with rat poison. This wasn't a crime of passion, this was premeditated murder, planned and executed with careful consideration. Sharon Ross would later testify that she watched her husband prepare this deadly cocktail. She described seeing him add the rat poison to the drink, knowing exactly what he intended to do with it. When questioned about why she didn't try to stop him or warn Ronkia, Sharon claimed that she was terrified of Lester and feared for her own life. The meeting with Ronkia, ostensibly to discuss Macera's custody, became the setting for murder. Lester offered Ronkia the poisoned drink, probably under the guise of hospitality or as a peace offering during what he claimed was a difficult conversation about their daughter. Ronkia, having no reason to suspect that the father of her child would try to poison her, accepted the drink. She was probably focused on the conversation about Macera, growing increasingly concerned about why her daughter wasn't with Lester, not paying attention to the beverage in her hand. The effects of rat poison are not immediate, but they are devastating. As the poison began to take effect, Ronkia would have started feeling sick, confused, and weak. She may have realized that something was terribly wrong, but by then it was too late. The poison was already working its way through her system, shutting down her organs one by one. Sharon Ross testified that she witnessed Ronkia's final moments. She described how, as the poison was taking effect, Lester took additional steps to ensure Ronkia's death. According to Sharon's testimony, he used a telephone cord to strangle Ronkia as she was dying from the poison, wanting to make sure that she was dead. But Sharon's testimony revealed something even more chilling. She said that after killing Ronkia, Lester turned to her and made a threat that would keep her silent for over a year. He wrapped the same telephone cord around Sharon's neck and told her that if she ever told anyone what had happened, he would kill her too. With Ronkia Holmes dead, Lester Ross now faced the monumental task of covering up not one, but 2 murders. He had the body of his 3-year-old daughter in his freezer, and now he had the body of his daughter's mother to deal with as well. The web of deception was becoming more complex, but Lester seemed determined to maintain his secret at any cost. The first challenge was disposing of Ronkia's body. Unlike Macera, who was small enough to fit in a freezer, Ronkia's body required a different approach. Lester decided to bury her, but he needed to choose a location that would be remote enough to avoid discovery while still being accessible enough for him to transport and bury the body. He chose an orange grove in Winter Haven, Florida. Orange groves are common in Central Florida, and many areas within them are isolated and rarely visited by anyone other than the workers who tend to the trees. It was a calculated choice, somewhere that would provide cover from prying eyes while still being relatively easy to access. But Lester didn't bury Ronkia alone. In what can only be described as an act of supreme callousness, he retrieved Macera's body from the freezer and buried mother and daughter together in the same shallow grave. The little girl who had been frozen for months was finally laid to rest, but not with the dignity and ceremony she deserved. Instead, she was hastily buried in a secret grave with her murdered mother. The burial site was chosen carefully. It was in a remote part of the orange grove, far from the main roads and areas where workers would typically be present. Lester dug a shallow grave, deep enough to conceal the bodies, but not so deep that it would take an excessive amount of time or effort. He was probably working under cover of darkness, anxious to complete this grisly task and return home. After burying the bodies, Lester had to return to his normal life and maintain the pretense that nothing had happened. But now he had to explain not only Macera's absence, but also Ronkia's sudden disappearance. He had to come up with a story that would satisfy both Ronkia's family in Georgia and any local authorities who might start asking questions. His solution was to claim that Ronkia had picked up Macera and left. He told people that she had come to Florida, collected her daughter, and returned to Georgia. It was a simple story, and one that might have worked if Ronkia's family hadn't been expecting to hear from her. But Ronkia's family knew something was wrong almost immediately. She had been in regular contact with them throughout her trip to Florida, and her last communication had been about meeting Lester at Walmart to pick up Macera. When she didn't call to let them know she had safely collected her daughter, they became concerned. Ronkia's mother, Edith Fletcher, was particularly worried. She knew her daughter would never fail to call and let her know that she and Macera were safe. When days passed without any word from Ronkia, Edith knew that something terrible had happened. The family contacted local authorities in both Georgia and Florida, reporting both Ronkia and Masera as missing persons. This began an investigation that would span more than a year, as authorities tried to piece together what had happened to the mother and daughter who had simply vanished. For more than a year, from October 2009 through December 2010, Lester Ross and Sharon Ross lived with the knowledge of what had happened to Ronkia Holmes and Masera Ross. They went about their daily lives, maintaining the pretense that nothing unusual had occurred, while the bodies of a mother and her young daughter lay buried in a shallow grave in an orange grove. This period must have been psychologically torturous for Sharon Ross. According to her later testimony, she had witnessed both the death of Masera and the murder of Ronkia. She knew where the bodies were buried, and she lived every day knowing that two innocent people had been killed by her husband. Yet she remained silent, paralyzed by fear of what Lester might do to her if she spoke out. The psychological toll of keeping such a secret must have been enormous. Sharon later testified that Lester had threatened her life, warning her that if she ever told anyone what had happened, he would kill her too. She had seen what he was capable of, she had watched him kill Ronkia in cold blood and had lived with the knowledge that he had killed his own daughter. She had every reason to believe that he would follow through on his threat. During this time, authorities continued to investigate the disappearance of Ronkia and Masera. Missing person reports had been filed, and detectives were trying to piece together what had happened. They interviewed Lester Ross, as he was the last person known to have seen both victims. But Lester stuck to his story. He claimed that Ronkia had picked up Masera and left, and he had no idea where they had gone. The investigation was complicated by the fact that it involved two different states. Ronkia was from Georgia, but she had disappeared in Florida. This meant that multiple law enforcement agencies were involved, and coordination between them was sometimes challenging. Additionally, there was no physical evidence of a crime, no blood, no signs of struggle, no witnesses, other than Sharon, who remained silent. Lester Ross seemed to be living a relatively normal life during this period. He continued working, maintained his household, and appeared to be just another person going about his daily business. But he was also making mistakes, small ones at first, but mistakes nonetheless, that would eventually lead to his downfall. One of the most significant factors working against Lester was the persistence of Ronkia's family. Her mother, Edith Fletcher, refused to accept that her daughter would simply disappear without a trace. She continued to pressure authorities to investigate, and she kept Ronkia's case in the public eye. This constant pressure meant that the case never went completely cold, even as months passed without any new developments. The stress of maintaining such a massive lie for over a year must have been overwhelming. Lester had to remember his story and stick to it consistently, even as investigators asked him the same questions multiple times and tried to catch him in contradictions. He had to maintain his composure while knowing that the bodies of his victims were buried just miles away from where he lived. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of this period was the effect it had on Sharon Ross. Living with the knowledge of what had happened, combined with the constant fear of her husband, was taking a toll on her mental and emotional health. She was essentially trapped in a marriage with a man she knew to be a cold-blooded killer, unable to escape because she feared for her own life. As 2010 progressed, the investigation into the disappearance of Ronkia Holmes and Masera Ross continued, though progress was slow. Law enforcement agencies in both Georgia and Florida were working the case, but they were hampered by the lack of physical evidence and the apparent cooperation of their primary suspect, Lester Ross. From the investigators' perspective, they had a missing person case with very few leads. Ronkia had traveled to Florida to pick up her daughter, and then both mother and child had vanished. The last person known to have seen them was Lester Ross, who claimed that Ronkia had collected Masera and left. Without evidence to contradict this story, investigators had little to work with. But there were inconsistencies in Lester's account that kept investigators interested. For example, Ronkia's family insisted that she would never have left Florida without contacting them to let them know she and Masera were safe. This was completely out of character for Ronkia, who had been in regular contact with her family throughout her trip to Florida. Additionally, there were no financial records showing that Ronkia had made any purchases or used any services after October 18, 2009. Her bank accounts remained untouched, her cell phone went silent, and there were no credit card transactions. It was as if she and Mossera had simply vanished from the face of the earth. Investigators also found it suspicious that Lester couldn't provide any specific details about when or where Ronkia had supposedly picked up Mossera. His story was vague and general, lacking the kind of specific details that would be expected from someone recounting a real event. When pressed for more information, he would claim that he couldn't remember exactly what had happened, or that he had been distracted by other things. The investigation took on new urgency when authorities began to suspect that they might be dealing with a double homicide rather than a missing person case. The complete absence of any trace of Ronkia or Mossera after October 18, 2009, suggested that something had happened to them, and all evidence pointed to Lester Ross as the most likely suspect. During this period, investigators began to take a closer look at Lester's background and behavior. They discovered that he had a history of controlling behavior and that there had been some issues in his relationship with Ronkia regarding custody of Mossera. While these factors didn't prove that he had committed murder, they added to the investigators' suspicions. Law enforcement also began to pay closer attention to Sharon Ross, recognizing that as Lester's wife, she might have information about what had happened. However, their initial attempts to interview her were unsuccessful. Sharon claimed that she didn't know anything about Ronkia and Mossera's disappearance, and she supported her husband's version of events. What investigators didn't realize at the time was that Sharon was living in constant fear of her husband. She wanted to tell the truth about what had happened, but she was terrified of what Lester might do to her if she spoke out. The threat he had made after killing Ronkia, that he would kill Sharon too if she ever told anyone, was very real in her mind. As 2010 drew to a close, the investigation seemed to be at a standstill. Despite the best efforts of law enforcement, they had been unable to find any concrete evidence of what had happened to Ronkia and Mossera. The case remained open, but without new leads or evidence, progress was impossible. The breakthrough that investigators had been waiting for came in December 2010, more than a year after Ronkia Holmes and Mossera Ross had disappeared. It came from an unexpected source, Sharon Ross herself, who finally found the courage to tell the truth about what had happened. The exact circumstances that led to Sharon's decision to come forward are not entirely clear from the public record, but it appears that the stress of living with such a terrible secret for over a year had finally become unbearable. Perhaps she realized that investigators were closing in on the truth, or perhaps she simply couldn't live with the guilt and fear any longer. On December 20, 2010, Sharon Ross contacted the Winter Haven Police Department and told them that she had information about the disappearance of Ronkia Holmes and Mossera Ross. When investigators arrived to interview her, she revealed the shocking truth about what had happened in her home over the past year and a half. Sharon told investigators that Mossera had died in May 2009, while in the care of her father, Lester Ross. She said that when she returned home that day, she found the child dead, and that Lester had told her it was an accident. Most horrifyingly, she revealed that Lester had placed Mossera's body in their deep freezer, where it had remained for months. She then told investigators about Ronkia's murder in October 2009. She described how Lester had prepared the rat poison cocktail, how he had given it to Ronkia during their meeting, and how he had strangled her with a telephone cord as she was dying from the poison. She also revealed that Lester had threatened to kill her if she ever told anyone what had happened. Finally, Sharon told investigators where the bodies were buried. She directed them to the Orange Grove in Winter Haven where Lester had buried both Ronkia and Mossera in the same shallow grave. This revelation was exactly what investigators needed to move forward with the case. They immediately obtained search warrants and began the process of recovering the bodies. On December 23, 2010, just days after Sharon's confession, the remains of Ronkia Holmes and Mossera Ross were discovered in the Orange Grove, exactly where Sharon had said they would be. The discovery of the bodies confirmed everything that Sharon had told investigators. Forensic examination would later reveal evidence consistent with poisoning in Ronkia's remains, and the location and condition of the bodies supported Sharon's account of how they had been buried. With this physical evidence and Sharon's testimony, investigators finally had what they needed to arrest Lester Ross. On December 23, 2010, the same day the bodies were discovered, Lester Ross was arrested and charged with the murders of Ronkia Holmes and Massera Ross. The arrest brought an end to more than a year of uncertainty for the families of the victims. Ronkia's mother, Edith Fletcher, finally had answers about what had happened to her daughter and granddaughter, though those answers brought no comfort, only the confirmation of her worst fears. For Sharon Ross, coming forward took tremendous courage, but it also brought new challenges. She would now have to testify about what she had witnessed, reliving the traumatic events she had kept secret for so long. She would also have to face the scrutiny of the legal system and the public, who would question why she had remained silent for so long. The legal proceedings against Lester Ross would take several years to complete, as the case worked its way through the Florida court system. He was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Ronkia Holmes and aggravated manslaughter in the death of Massera Ross. The prosecution argued that Ronkia's murder was premeditated, while Massera's death was classified as manslaughter, though the circumstances of her death were never fully clarified. Sharon Ross became the star witness for the prosecution. Her testimony was crucial to the case, as she was the only person who had witnessed both crimes and could provide first-hand accounts of what had happened. However, her testimony was also controversial, as many people questioned why she had remained silent for so long while knowing that two people had been murdered. During the trial, Sharon described in detail what she had witnessed. She testified about finding Massera dead in May 2009 and about Lester's decision to hide the body in their freezer. She described watching Lester prepare the rat poison cocktail that would kill Ronkia, and she recounted the horrific scene of Ronkia's murder. She also testified about the threat Lester had made against her life, explaining why she had remained silent for so long. The prosecution presented a case that painted Lester Ross as a cold, calculating killer who had murdered his own daughter and then killed the child's mother to cover up his crime. They argued that both murders were the result of Lester's selfish desire to avoid responsibility for his actions. The defense, meanwhile, attempted to cast doubt on Sharon's testimony, arguing that she was not a reliable witness and that she had her own reasons for wanting to see Lester convicted. They also tried to argue that Massera's death had been accidental, as Lester had originally claimed. However, the physical evidence supported Sharon's testimony. The location of the bodies, the condition of the remains, and the forensic evidence all corroborated her account of what had happened. The prosecution also presented evidence of Lester's deceptive behavior during the investigation, including his false statements to police and his attempts to mislead investigators. In November 2015, after years of legal proceedings, Lester Ross was convicted on all charges. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Ronkia Holmes and aggravated manslaughter in the death of Massera Ross. On February 18, 2016, Lester Ross was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Ronkia Holmes and 30 years for the aggravated manslaughter of Massera Ross. The sentences were to run consecutively, meaning that Lester Ross would spend the rest of his life in prison. As we come to the end of this tragic story, it's important to remember that at the heart of this case are two innocent victims, Ronkia Holmes and Massera Ross. Ronkia was a young mother who was working hard to build a better life for herself and her daughter. She was pursuing her education, making sacrifices so that she could provide for Massera's future. She trusted the father of her child to care for their daughter, a trust that was tragically betrayed. Massera was just 3 years old when her life was cut short. She was a little girl who should have had decades ahead of her, first days of school, birthday parties, family vacations, graduations, maybe children of her own someday. Instead, her life ended before it had really begun, and she became the victim of the person who should have protected her most. The case of Ronkia Holmes and Massera Ross serves as a stark reminder of the vulnerability of those who depend on others for their safety and well-being. It shows us how quickly trust can be betrayed and how devastating the consequences can be when someone chooses to put their own interests above the lives of others. This case also highlights the importance of speaking out when we witness wrongdoing. Sharon Ross's silence for over a year allowed Lester Ross to continue living freely while the families of his victims suffered not knowing what had happened to their loved ones. While Sharon's fear was understandable, her eventual decision to come forward was what finally brought justice for Ronkia and Mausera. Today, Ronkia Holmes and Mausera Ross rest in peace, finally free from the secrets and lies that surrounded their deaths. Their story has been told, their killer has been brought to justice, and their memory lives on in the hearts of those who loved them. As we close this story, let us remember Ronkia and Mausera not as victims, but as individuals who deserved so much more than the fate that befell them. Let us honor their memory by speaking out against injustice, by protecting those who cannot protect themselves, and by never forgetting that behind every true crime story are real people whose lives mattered. Please, I'm putting it out there, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight, we're traveling to the quiet rural areas of Michigan, where in 2005, a young man's mysterious disappearance would lead to one of the most puzzling death investigations in the state's history. This is the story of Todd Geib, a 22-year-old whose final moments remain shrouded in questions that continue to haunt investigators and his family nearly 2 decades later. So let me take you through this intricate mystery that challenges everything we think we know about accidental drowning. Todd Matthew Geib was born in 1983, growing up in the small, tight-knit community of Casnovia, Michigan. Casnovia is the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where Friday night football games bring the whole town together, and where young people often dream of bigger cities while secretly cherishing the safety and familiarity of home. Todd was, by all accounts, a young man with his whole life ahead of him. At 22, he possessed that particular energy that comes with being on the cusp of true adulthood. He had recently graduated from high school a few years prior and was working steadily, contributing to his family's household and saving money for his future. Those who knew Todd described him as responsible, level-headed, and someone who rarely found himself in trouble. He lived with his mother, Kathy Geib, in their modest home. Kathy was a devoted single mother who had worked hard to provide for her family, and Todd was her pride and joy. Their relationship was close, built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Todd wasn't the type to disappear without word, wasn't the type to cause his mother worry unnecessarily. Todd stood about 5 feet 10 inches and weighed around 160 pounds. He had brown hair that he kept neat, and friends would later describe him as having an easy smile and a quick wit. He was athletic without being obsessive about it, social without being reckless, and responsible without being boring. In many ways, Todd represented the kind of young adult that small-town America produces regularly: decent, hardworking, and optimistic about the future. But Todd also lived in a world that was rapidly changing. The year 2005 was a time when social media was just beginning to emerge, when cell phones were becoming more common but weren't yet the lifelines they would become. Communication was still largely face-to-face or through landlines, and when someone disappeared, the immediate digital trail that we rely on today simply didn't exist. The spring of 2005 had been particularly beautiful in Michigan. The harsh winter had finally given way to warm days and cool nights, perfect for the kind of outdoor gatherings that rural communities cherish. It was this seasonal transition that would set the stage for the events of June 11th and 12th, 2005, a weekend that would change everything for Todd Geib and his family. As we delve deeper into this story, keep in mind that Todd was not someone who courted danger or made reckless decisions. He was not struggling with addiction, wasn't involved in dangerous activities, and had no known enemies. This context makes what happened to him all the more disturbing and mysterious. Saturday night, June 11, 2005, was warm and clear in Casnovia. The kind of night that seems made for outdoor gatherings, for celebrating the arrival of summer, for being young and carefree. Word had spread, as it does in small communities, about a party being planned for that evening. Not just any party, but a keg party with a bonfire, the kind of gathering that draws young people from surrounding areas. The party was to be held behind an apple orchard, about 2 miles north of White Road. This location was chosen carefully. It was remote enough to avoid complaints from neighbors, large enough to accommodate a significant crowd, and had the natural privacy that comes with being surrounded by agricultural land and marshy terrain. As the sun set on that Saturday evening, cars began making their way down the rural roads toward the orchard. The area was characterized by its challenging terrain, marshy ground with hip-high grass that stretched for miles in every direction. This wasn't the kind of place you'd want to wander around in the dark if you didn't know the area well. Todd arrived at the party that evening, though exactly when and with whom remains somewhat unclear. What we do know is that he was among approximately 100 people who gathered that night. The party was typical of rural gatherings: a large bonfire, kegs of beer, music playing from car stereos, and young people enjoying what felt like the beginning of a perfect summer. Witnesses would later describe the atmosphere as festive and friendly. There were no reports of fights, no significant arguments, no drama that would typically precede a violent incident. Todd was seen socializing, talking with friends, and generally appearing to enjoy himself. He was dressed casually, the kind of clothes appropriate for an outdoor gathering where you might end up sitting on the ground or standing close to a fire. The party continued well into the night, with people coming and going as such events typically unfold. Some partygoers would leave early, others would stay until the bonfire burned down to embers. It was the kind of gathering where people felt safe, where the biggest concerns were typically about getting home safely after drinking, not about personal safety in any more serious sense. As the evening progressed into the early morning hours of Sunday, June 12, the crowd began to thin. This is when the timeline becomes critical, though frustratingly imprecise. Various witnesses would later report seeing Todd at different times, but the exact sequence of events remains murky. What we know for certain is that Todd was still at the party in the early morning hours. He had been drinking. This was a keg party, after all, but witnesses didn't describe him as being dangerously intoxicated. He was walking under his own power, engaging in conversation, and generally appearing to be in control of his faculties. The property where the party was held was extensive and confusing, especially in the dark. The marshy terrain with its tall grass created a landscape that could be disorienting even for those familiar with the area. There were no streetlights, no clear paths, and the natural features of the land could easily confuse someone trying to navigate in the darkness. As the party wound down, people began making their way back to their vehicles and heading home. This is where Todd's story takes its mysterious turn. At some point in the early morning hours, Todd was no longer at the party. Exactly when he left, how he left, and most importantly, why he left, remain questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. Some witnesses reported seeing Todd walking away from the party area, but their accounts varied on the direction he was heading and the time this occurred. Was he leaving with friends? Was he attempting to walk home? Did he become disoriented and wander off accidentally? Or was there something more sinister at play? The marshy terrain around the party location extended for approximately 6 miles, filled with tall grass, uneven ground, and natural obstacles that would be treacherous to navigate in darkness. For someone unfamiliar with the area, or for someone whose judgment might be impaired by alcohol, this landscape could quickly become dangerous. But Todd was a local. He knew the area reasonably well, having grown up in Casnovia. This wasn't unfamiliar territory to him, which makes his disappearance all the more puzzling. Local knowledge should have helped him navigate safely, should have prevented him from becoming lost or disoriented. As the sun rose on Sunday morning, June 12, 2005, most of the partygoers had made their way home safely. The bonfire had burned down to ashes, the empty keg stood as silent testimony to the night's festivities, and the marshy field behind the orchard was quiet once again. But somewhere in that vast expanse of grass and wetland, Todd Geib was missing. When Todd Geib failed to return home on Sunday morning, his mother Kathy initially wasn't overly concerned. Todd was 22 years old, after all, and it wasn't entirely unusual for young people to stay out late after parties, perhaps crashing at a friend's house or simply losing track of time. But as Sunday stretched on with no word from her son, Kathy's concern began to grow. Todd was responsible about checking in with his mother. Even at 22, he understood that she worried, and he made an effort to let her know his whereabouts, especially if he was going to be out all night. The silence was unlike him, and by Sunday evening, Kathy knew something was wrong. She began making phone calls, reaching out to Todd's friends and acquaintances, trying to piece together the events of the previous night. The responses she received were troubling. Several people confirmed that Todd had been at the party, but no one seemed to know exactly when or how he had left. Some thought they remembered seeing him later in the evening, others weren't sure. The timeline was frustratingly vague. By Monday morning, June 13th, Kathy's concern had escalated to genuine alarm. She contacted the authorities, reporting her son missing. The initial response was measured. Young adults sometimes disappear for a day or two, especially after parties. But Kathy insisted that this was not normal behavior for Todd, that he would never voluntarily cause her this kind of worry. The investigation began with interviews of party attendees. This proved to be a challenging task, as there had been approximately 100 people at the gathering, many of whom had been drinking and might not have clear memories of the evening's events. Additionally, some partygoers were reluctant to speak with police, fearing potential legal consequences for underage drinking or other activities. From these interviews, investigators began to construct a timeline of Todd's final hours. He had definitely been at the party, had been seen by multiple witnesses, and had been drinking beer throughout the evening. Various witnesses placed him at the party at different times, but the accounts were inconsistent regarding when he might have left and in what direction he might have headed. The search for Todd began in earnest. The terrain around the party location was challenging for search teams. The marshy ground, tall grass, and extensive area made it difficult to conduct a thorough search. But search teams, including volunteers from the local community, began combing through the area systematically. Search dogs were brought in to try to pick up Todd's scent. The dogs showed interest in various areas around the party location, but the scent trails were confused and contradictory. This could have been due to the large number of people who had been in the area for the party, or it could have indicated that Todd had moved through multiple areas during the night. The search expanded beyond the immediate party location. Teams searched along roads that Todd might have taken if he had tried to walk home. They searched through fields and wooded areas, checked abandoned buildings, and followed up on any potential sightings reported by members of the public. As the days passed, the search became more intensive. The Michigan State Police took over the investigation, bringing in additional resources and expertise. Helicopters were used to search from the air, providing a broader view of the extensive terrain. Dive teams were brought in to search various bodies of water in the area, though there were no immediate indications that Todd had entered water. The searches were thorough and professional, but they were also hampered by the challenging terrain and the large area that needed to be covered. The marshy ground made it difficult for search teams to move efficiently, and the tall grass could easily conceal evidence or even a person. Local volunteers joined the search efforts, demonstrating the kind of community spirit that characterizes small towns. Todd's disappearance had shaken the community, and people wanted to help in any way they could. Search parties were organized, with volunteers covering areas that might have been missed by professional search teams. As the search continued, investigators also began looking into Todd's background more carefully. They interviewed his friends and family, trying to understand if there might have been any reason for him to disappear voluntarily. What they found was consistent with what Kathy had told them. Todd was responsible, stable, and not the type to disappear without explanation. There were no signs of depression, no financial troubles, no relationship problems that might have motivated Todd to leave voluntarily. His bank accounts showed no unusual activity, his car was found at his home, and there were no indications that he had planned to go anywhere other than to the party that Saturday night. The investigation also looked into whether Todd might have been the victim of foul play. Were there any conflicts at the party? Any arguments or confrontations that might have escalated? The interviews with party attendees suggested that the atmosphere had been generally peaceful, with no significant disputes or tensions. As the search stretched into its second week, hope began to fade. The terrain had been searched multiple times, bodies of water had been examined, and there were no credible sightings of Todd. The case was becoming a mystery that seemed to have no solution. But then, on July 2, 2005, exactly 21 days after Todd had disappeared, everything changed. Saturday, July 2, 2005, dawned warm and clear in Muskegon County, Michigan. It had been exactly 3 weeks since Todd Geib had vanished from the party behind the apple orchard, and the extensive search efforts had yielded no trace of the missing young man. The case was beginning to feel cold, the kind of mystery that might never be solved. But on this particular morning, everything was about to change in the most unexpected and disturbing way possible. The discovery occurred at a private lake, a small body of water nestled in the rural landscape not far from where Todd had last been seen. This wasn't just any lake, it was located in an area that had been thoroughly searched by professional search teams, volunteers, and law enforcement officials. The water had been examined, the shoreline had been combed, and there had been no indication that Todd was anywhere in the vicinity. The person who made the discovery was a local resident who had come to the lake that morning. What they saw defied logic and challenged everything that investigators thought they knew about Todd's disappearance. There, in the water, was a human figure standing upright. Not floating face down, as drowning victims typically do. Not caught in vegetation or debris. But standing upright in the water, with the head and shoulders visible above the surface, as if the person had simply walked into the lake and stopped there, frozen in place. The figure was Todd Geib. The initial shock of the discovery was compounded by the bizarre nature of the scene. Bodies that have been in water for extended periods don't typically remain upright. The natural process of decomposition, combined with the effects of water and aquatic life, generally causes bodies to float and move with currents. But Todd appeared to be standing as if he had simply walked into the lake and remained there. Emergency responders were called to the scene, and the recovery operation began. What they found challenged many of their assumptions about drowning deaths and decomposition. Todd's body showed remarkably little decomposition for someone who had supposedly been missing for 3 weeks. His clothing appeared unusually clean, free from the algae, debris, and aquatic vegetation that typically accumulates on bodies that have been submerged for extended periods. The lake itself was not large, and the water was relatively shallow in the area where Todd was found. This raised immediate questions about how he could have remained undiscovered for so long in a location that had been searched multiple times. The area was not hidden or particularly remote, it was the kind of place that search teams would have examined carefully. Word of the discovery spread quickly through the small community. For Todd's family, the news brought a mixture of relief and horror, relief that their son had been found, but horror at the circumstances of his discovery and the implications of what they were seeing. The Michigan State Police took control of the scene, beginning the process of documenting the discovery and preparing for the investigation that would follow. Crime scene photographers captured the scene from multiple angles, trying to document exactly how Todd's body had been positioned in the water. The position of the body raised immediate questions. Drowning victims typically float face down, with their bodies following the natural laws of physics and decomposition. But Todd appeared to have been standing upright, which suggested either that he had died very recently, or that there were factors at play that the investigators didn't yet understand. The condition of Todd's clothing was another puzzling element. After 3 weeks in water, clothing typically shows significant effects from aquatic environment, algae growth, discoloration, debris accumulation. But Todd's clothes appeared remarkably clean and intact, almost as if they had been washed rather than sitting in lake water for weeks. The water itself was examined for any clues about what might have happened. The lake was not particularly deep, and the bottom was accessible to divers. There were no obvious signs of struggle, no evidence of trauma to the surrounding area, and no indication that Todd had been involved in any kind of violent encounter. As the recovery operation continued, investigators began to grapple with the implications of what they were seeing. If Todd had been in the water for 3 weeks, why did his body show so little decomposition? If he had drowned shortly after leaving the party, why hadn't he been discovered during the extensive search efforts? And why was he standing upright in a position that seemed to defy the natural processes of death and decomposition? The discovery also raised questions about the timeline of Todd's disappearance. Had he really been missing for the full 3 weeks, or had something else happened? Could he have been held somewhere else and only recently placed in the lake? The condition of his body suggested that he had not been in the water for the full duration of his disappearance. The scene was processed with all the care and attention that a potential crime scene requires. Every detail was documented, every piece of potential evidence was collected, and every aspect of the discovery was recorded for later analysis. But even as the professional investigation proceeded, those at the scene were grappling with the unsettling nature of what they were witnessing. The discovery of Todd Geib's body in that small lake marked the beginning of a new phase in the investigation. What had been a missing person case was now a death investigation, but the circumstances of the discovery suggested that this would be anything but a straightforward case. The autopsy of Todd Geib was conducted by the Michigan State Police, and what it revealed would only deepen the mystery surrounding his death. Dr. Stephen Cole, the forensic pathologist who performed the examination, found several factors that contradicted the initial assumption that Todd had drowned shortly after leaving the party. The first and most significant finding was the absence of water in Todd's lungs. In typical drowning cases, victims will have inhaled water as they struggle to breathe, leaving clear evidence of the drowning process. But Todd's lungs contained no water whatsoever. This finding alone challenged the drowning theory and suggested that something else had caused his death. The blood alcohol content measured in Todd's system was 0.12, which was certainly above the legal limit for driving but not at a level that would typically cause someone to lose consciousness or become completely incapacitated. This level of intoxication might impair judgment and coordination, but it wouldn't typically lead to a fatal accident for someone with Todd's experience with alcohol. More puzzling was the discovery of 2 antidepressant medications in Todd's system, amitriptyline and desipramine. These drugs had never been prescribed to Todd, and there was no indication that he had access to them or any reason to take them. The presence of these medications raised immediate questions about how they had entered his system and what role they might have played in his death. Amitriptyline and desipramine are tricyclic antidepressants that can have serious side effects, especially when combined with alcohol. They can cause sedation, confusion, and in large doses, can be fatal. But Todd had no history of depression, no prescription for these medications, and no known access to them. Their presence in his system suggested either that he had taken them voluntarily for unknown reasons, or that someone else had administered them to him. The condition of Todd's body also provided important clues about the timeline of his death. Despite having been missing for 3 weeks, his body showed relatively little decomposition. This suggested that he had not been in the water for the full duration of his disappearance, or that there were environmental factors that had slowed the decomposition process. The lack of significant decomposition was particularly puzzling given the warm weather that had prevailed during the 3 weeks of Todd's disappearance. Under normal circumstances, a body submerged in water during warm weather would show significant decomposition after 21 days. But Todd's body was in much better condition than would be expected under these circumstances. The positioning of Todd's body in the water also defied normal expectations. Bodies that have been in water for extended periods typically float face down, following the natural processes of decomposition and the effects of water currents. But Todd had been found standing upright, which suggested either that he had died very recently, or that there were factors at play that investigators didn't understand. The absence of defensive wounds or signs of trauma was another important finding. If Todd had been the victim of violence, there would typically be evidence of a struggle or assault. But his body showed no signs of having been in a fight or having suffered any kind of physical attack. The clothing that Todd was wearing when found also provided clues about what had happened to him. His clothes were remarkably clean and intact, free from the algae, debris, and aquatic vegetation that typically accumulates on clothing that has been submerged for extended periods. This suggested that either Todd had not been in the water for very long, or that his clothes had been cleaned somehow. The autopsy also revealed that Todd had eaten a meal several hours before his death, which was consistent with his attendance at the party. The contents of his stomach helped establish a timeline for his final hours, though they didn't provide any clues about what had happened to him after he left the party. Perhaps most significantly, the autopsy findings suggested that Todd had been dead for only 2 to 5 days before his body was discovered, not the full 3 weeks that he had been missing. This finding would later be supported by additional forensic analysis, but it raised profound questions about where Todd had been during the time between his disappearance and his death. If Todd had only been dead for a few days when his body was discovered, where had he been for the previous 2.5 weeks? Had he been held somewhere against his will? Had he been injured and unable to return home? Or had he left voluntarily for reasons that remain unknown? The autopsy findings also raised questions about the cause of Todd's death. If he hadn't drowned, what had killed him? The presence of the antidepressant medication suggested a possible drug overdose, but it was unclear whether this was accidental, intentional, or the result of foul play. The combination of alcohol and antidepressants can be dangerous, potentially causing respiratory depression, cardiac arrhythmias, and other life-threatening complications. But without more information about how much of these medications Todd had consumed, and when he had consumed them, it was difficult to determine whether they had been the cause of his death. The autopsy results were shared with Todd's family, who were devastated by the implications of what they revealed. The suggestion that Todd had not been in the water for the full 3 weeks of his disappearance raised horrifying questions about what might have happened to him during that time. The autopsy findings prompted the Michigan State Police to seek additional expert analysis, hoping to better understand the contradictory evidence surrounding Todd Geib's death. What they discovered would only add to the mystery and raise more questions about what had actually happened to the young man. Dr. Cyril Wecht, a renowned forensic pathologist, was consulted to review the case. Dr. Wecht had decades of experience in high-profile death investigations and had worked on some of the most challenging forensic cases in American history. His analysis of Todd's case would prove to be illuminating and disturbing. After reviewing the autopsy results, crime scene photographs, and other evidence, Dr. Wecht concluded that Todd had not been in the water for the full 3 weeks of his disappearance. The condition of the body, the lack of decomposition, and the cleanliness of the clothing all suggested that Todd had been in the water for a much shorter period, perhaps only a few days. This finding was later supported by Dr. Ljubisa Dragovic, another respected forensic pathologist. Dr. Dragovic's analysis also indicated that Todd had been dead for only 2 to 5 days before his body was discovered, not the full 21 days that he had been missing. The implications of these findings were profound. If Todd had only been dead for a few days when found, where had he been for the previous 2.5 weeks? Had he been held captive? Had he been injured and unable to return home? Or had he left voluntarily for reasons that remained unknown? The expert analysis also focused on the unusual positioning of Todd's body in the water. Bodies that have been submerged for extended periods typically float face down, following the natural processes of decomposition and water dynamics. But Todd had been found standing upright, which defied normal expectations. Dr. Wecht noted that for a body to remain upright in water, it would typically need to be weighted down or somehow anchored. But no weights or anchoring devices were found with Todd's body. This suggested that either he had entered the water very recently before being discovered, or that there were factors at play that the investigators didn't understand. The cleanliness of Todd's clothing was another factor that puzzled the experts. After even a few days in lake water, clothing typically shows significant effects from the aquatic environment, algae growth, discoloration, debris accumulation. But Todd's clothes appeared remarkably clean and intact. The presence of the antidepressant medications in Todd's system was perhaps the most disturbing finding. Amitriptyline and desipramine are prescription medications that Todd had never been prescribed and had no known access to. Their presence in his system suggested either that he had obtained them illegally, or that someone had administered them to him without his knowledge. The combination of these medications with alcohol can be dangerous, potentially causing sedation, confusion, and in large doses, death. But the levels found in Todd's system weren't necessarily fatal on their own, which raised questions about what role they might have played in his death. The expert analysis also considered the possibility that Todd's death was the result of foul play. The presence of unprescribed medications in his system, combined with the unusual circumstances of his discovery, suggested that someone else might have been involved in his death. However, there were no obvious signs of violence or struggle. Todd's body showed no defensive wounds, no signs of trauma, and no indication that he had been in a fight. If he had been the victim of violence, it would have been a very sophisticated and carefully planned attack. The location where Todd's body was discovered also raised questions. The lake was in an area that had been searched multiple times by professional search teams, volunteers, and law enforcement officials. How had Todd's body remained undiscovered for so long in such a thoroughly searched location? One possibility was that Todd's body had been placed in the lake shortly before it was discovered. This would explain why it showed so little decomposition and why it had not been found during the earlier search efforts. But this theory raised its own questions about who might have placed the body there and why. The expert analysis also considered the possibility that Todd had been held somewhere else during the time between his disappearance and his death. This could explain why his body showed so little decomposition and why he had not been found during the search efforts. But it also raised horrifying questions about what might have happened to him during that time. The forensic evidence suggested that Todd's death was far more complex than it initially appeared. The combination of the unusual positioning of his body, the lack of decomposition, the cleanliness of his clothing, and the presence of unprescribed medications all pointed to a death that was anything but straightforward. Dr. Weck's analysis concluded that the evidence did not support the theory that Todd had drowned shortly after leaving the party. Instead, the evidence suggested that Todd had died only a few days before his body was discovered, and that his death might have been the result of foul play. The expert analysis provided by Dr. Wecht and Dr. Dragovic would later be presented at medical examiner conferences, where it generated significant discussion and debate. The case was unusual enough that it attracted attention from forensic experts across the country, many of whom agreed that the evidence did not support the official conclusion of accidental drowning. Despite the compelling evidence presented by forensic experts suggesting that Todd Geib had not been in the water for the full duration of his disappearance, the Michigan State Police maintained their position that his death was the result of accidental drowning. The official investigation concluded that Todd had left the party intoxicated, become disoriented in the marshy terrain, and somehow made his way to the lake where he drowned. This official conclusion was deeply unsatisfying to many who had followed the case, including Todd's family, the forensic experts who had analyzed the evidence, and members of the public who had become interested in the mystery. The evidence seemed to contradict the official narrative in several significant ways. The Michigan State Police acknowledged the presence of the antidepressant medications in Todd's system but suggested that he might have taken them voluntarily, perhaps as part of some kind of drug experimentation. However, this explanation raised its own questions. Todd had no history of drug use, no known access to prescription medications, and no apparent reason to experiment with antidepressants. The police also acknowledged the unusual positioning of Todd's body in the water but suggested that this could be explained by the specific conditions of the lake and the effects of decomposition. However, this explanation was contradicted by the forensic experts who had concluded that Todd's body showed too little decomposition to have been in the water for 3 weeks. The investigation also struggled to explain how Todd's body had remained undiscovered for so long in an area that had been thoroughly searched. The lake where he was found was not remote or hidden, it was the kind of location that search teams would have examined carefully. The police suggested that the body might have been obscured by vegetation or other natural features, but this explanation was not entirely convincing. The official investigation also faced criticism for not adequately exploring the possibility of foul play. While the police acknowledged that the presence of unprescribed medications in Todd's system was unusual, they did not appear to have conducted a thorough investigation into how these substances might have entered his system or who might have had access to them. The investigation also did not adequately address the timeline discrepancies highlighted by the forensic experts. If Todd had only been dead for a few days when his body was discovered, where had he been for the previous 2.5 weeks? This question was never satisfactorily answered by the official investigation. The case was eventually closed with the official cause of death listed as undetermined drowning. This classification acknowledged that there were unanswered questions about Todd's death while still maintaining that drowning was the most likely cause. However, many felt that this conclusion was based more on convenience than on a thorough analysis of the evidence. The family's frustration with the official investigation was palpable. Kathy Geib, Todd's mother, publicly questioned the police conclusion and called for a more thorough investigation. She pointed to the expert analysis that suggested Todd had not been in the water for the full duration of his disappearance and argued that this evidence had not been adequately considered. The forensic experts who had analyzed the case also expressed frustration with the official conclusion. Dr. Wecht and Dr. Dragovic had both concluded that the evidence did not support the drowning theory, but their analysis appeared to have been dismissed by the investigating authorities. The case attracted attention from various media outlets, including television shows that specialized in unsolved mysteries and suspicious deaths. The unusual circumstances of Todd's discovery, combined with the conflicting expert opinions, made it the kind of case that captured public imagination and generated significant discussion. One of the most significant developments in the case came years later when it was featured on the television show, Smiley Face Killers: The Hunt for Justice. This show examined cases of young men who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances and were later found dead in bodies of water. The show's investigators suggested that Todd's death might be connected to a larger pattern of similar cases across the Midwest. The Smiley Face Killer theory, developed by retired New York City detectives Kevin Gannon and Anthony Duarte, suggests that a network of killers has been targeting young men, particularly college-aged men, causing their deaths and making them appear to be accidental drownings. The theory is controversial and has not been accepted by law enforcement agencies, but it has generated significant interest in cases like Todd's. The show's investigation into Todd's case brought renewed attention to the evidence that had been largely ignored by the official investigation. The show's experts conducted their own analysis of the forensic evidence and concluded that Todd's death was highly suspicious and deserved further investigation. The renewed attention to Todd's case also highlighted the broader issue of how deaths like his are investigated and classified. When a young person disappears and is later found dead in water, there is often a tendency to assume that the death was accidental, particularly if the person had been drinking. But cases like Todd's demonstrate that this assumption can be dangerous and can lead to inadequate investigations. The official investigation into Todd Geib's death remains one of the most controversial and unsatisfying aspects of the case. Despite compelling evidence suggesting that the death was not a simple case of accidental drowning, the authorities maintained their position and closed the case without adequately addressing the questions raised by forensic experts. The conclusion of the official investigation into Todd Geib's death was devastating for his family, particularly his mother Kathy. The official ruling of undetermined drowning felt like a betrayal of everything she knew about her son and a dismissal of the compelling evidence that suggested something far more sinister had occurred. Kathy Geib refused to accept the official conclusion. She knew her son better than anyone, and she knew that the circumstances of his death did not align with the young man she had raised. Todd was not reckless, not the type to wander into dangerous situations, and certainly not someone who would experiment with prescription medications that he had no access to. In the months and years following the official close of the investigation, Kathy became an advocate for her son's case. She reached out to media outlets, contacted private investigators, and sought the assistance of anyone who might be able to help her understand what had really happened to Todd. Her determination was fueled by a mother's love and a deep conviction that her son deserved justice. The family's efforts to keep Todd's case in the public eye were aided by the involvement of various television shows and documentary filmmakers who were interested in the mysterious circumstances surrounding his death. These media portrayals helped to raise awareness about the case and brought attention to the evidence that had been largely ignored by the official investigation. One of the most significant developments came when the case was featured on Smiley Face Killers: The Hunt for Justice. The show's investigators conducted their own analysis of the forensic evidence and interviewed experts who had been involved in the case. Their conclusion was that Todd's death was highly suspicious and deserved further investigation. The show's investigation also highlighted the broader pattern of similar cases across the Midwest: young men who had disappeared after nights out and were later found dead in bodies of water under suspicious circumstances. While the smiley face killer theory remains controversial, it provided a framework for understanding Todd's case as part of a larger phenomenon. Kathy Geib's advocacy for her son's case also brought attention to the broader issue of how suspicious deaths are investigated and classified. She argued that there was a tendency among law enforcement agencies to quickly classify deaths as accidental, particularly when the victims were young people who had been drinking. This rush to judgment, she argued, could lead to inadequate investigations and allow criminals to escape justice. The family's fight for truth was not just about Todd's case, it was about ensuring that other families would not have to endure the same kind of inadequate investigation and dismissive treatment that they had experienced. Kathy became a voice for other families who had lost loved ones under similar circumstances and who had been failed by the investigative system. The emotional toll of this fight was enormous. Kathy had lost her son under mysterious circumstances, and then had to battle for years to get authorities to take the evidence seriously. The stress of this ongoing struggle was evident in her public appearances and interviews, where she often appeared exhausted but determined. Despite the family's efforts, the official investigation was never reopened. The Michigan State Police maintained their position that Todd's death was the result of accidental drowning, and they showed no interest in reconsidering the evidence that had been presented by forensic experts. The case remains officially closed, but the questions surrounding Todd's death have never been satisfactorily answered. The family continues to seek answers, and the case continues to generate interest from researchers and investigators who believe that the truth about what happened to Todd Geib has yet to be revealed. As we reach the end of Todd Geib's story, we're left with more questions than answers. The official investigation concluded that his death was an accidental drowning, but the evidence suggests a far more complex and disturbing reality. The forensic analysis, the timeline discrepancies, and the unusual circumstances of his discovery all point to a case that deserves further investigation. The presence of unprescribed antidepressant medications in Todd's system remains one of the most troubling aspects of the case. How did these substances enter his system? Who had access to them? And what role did they play in his death? These questions have never been adequately addressed by the official investigation. The timeline of Todd's disappearance and death also raises profound questions. If he had only been dead for a few days when his body was discovered, where had he been for the previous 2.5 weeks? Was he held captive? Was he injured and unable to return home? Or did he leave voluntarily for reasons that remain unknown? The location where Todd's body was discovered continues to puzzle investigators and observers. How did his body remain undiscovered for so long in an area that had been thoroughly searched? Was it placed there shortly before discovery? And if so, by whom? The unusual positioning of Todd's body in the water also defies explanation. Bodies that have been in water for extended periods typically float face down, but Todd was found standing upright. This positioning suggests either that he had entered the water very recently, or that there were factors at play that investigators didn't understand. The cleanliness of Todd's clothing and the lack of decomposition in his body also contradict the official narrative. If he had been in the water for 3 weeks, his body and clothing should have shown significant effects from the aquatic environment. But they appeared remarkably clean and intact. These questions have led some to theorize that Todd's death was the result of foul play. The presence of unprescribed medications, the unusual circumstances of his discovery, and the timeline discrepancies all suggest that someone else might have been involved in his death. But if this was the case, who was responsible? And what was their motive? The smiley face killer theory provides one possible explanation for Todd's death. This controversial theory suggests that a network of killers has been targeting young men, particularly college-aged men, causing their deaths and making them appear to be accidental drownings. While this theory is not accepted by law enforcement agencies, it provides a framework for understanding Todd's case as part of a larger pattern. Other theories focus on the possibility that Todd was the victim of a robbery or assault that went wrong. Perhaps he was targeted because he was alone and vulnerable, and his death was the unintended consequence of a criminal act. But this theory doesn't explain the presence of the antidepressant medications in his system or the unusual circumstances of his discovery. Some have suggested that Todd's death might have been the result of a hazing incident or some kind of initiation ritual. Perhaps he was involved in activities that he kept secret from his family, and his death was the result of something that went wrong. But there is no evidence to support this theory, and it doesn't align with what we know about Todd's character and lifestyle. The truth about what happened to Todd Geib may never be known. The official investigation is closed, the evidence has been filed away, and the passage of time has made it increasingly unlikely that new information will emerge. But the questions surrounding his death continue to haunt those who have studied the case. For Todd's family, the lack of answers is a source of ongoing pain. They know that their son deserved better than the cursory investigation he received, and they continue to hope that someday the truth will emerge. Their fight for justice serves as a reminder that every death deserves a thorough investigation, regardless of the initial assumptions about what might have happened. Todd Geib's story is a reminder of how quickly a normal life can be transformed into a mystery that defies explanation. He was a young man with his whole life ahead of him, someone who should have had the opportunity to build a career, start a family, and contribute to his community. Instead, he became the subject of a case that continues to puzzle investigators and generate debate among experts. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Todd Geib, a young man whose death raises more questions than answers, whose case reminds us that the truth is not always as simple as it appears, and whose memory serves as a call for justice in cases where the evidence suggests that all is not as it seems. The mystery of Todd Geib's death may never be solved, but his story continues to resonate with those who believe that every life has value and that every death deserves to be properly investigated. In the quiet of the night, as you close your eyes, perhaps you'll spare a thought for Todd and for all the other young people whose deaths remain unexplained, whose cases remain unsolved, and whose families continue to search for answers that may never come. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, we're traveling to a small Pennsylvania town where Mother's Day 2018 would become a date that changed everything. This is the story of Rachel Deltonda, a beloved teacher whose life was cut short in her own driveway, leaving behind a web of secrets, small-town corruption, and a case that remains unsolved to this day. Rachel Elena Deltonda was 33 years old when her story came to its tragic end. She lived in Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, a small city in Beaver County that had seen better days. Once a thriving steel town, Aliquippa had become a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where secrets were hard to keep, and where the past had a way of catching up with you. Rachel was the kind of person who lit up a room. She had been a teacher, passionate about education and helping young people find their way. Those who knew her described her as vibrant, caring, and someone who genuinely wanted to make a difference in the world. But like many people, Rachel had faced her share of challenges and heartbreak. She lived with her parents, Lisa and Joe Deltonda, in a modest home on Buchanan Street. It wasn't unusual for adult children to live with their parents in a town like Aliquippa. The economy had been tough, and family ties ran deep. Rachel was working to get her life back on track after some difficult years, and those closest to her could see she was making progress. Rachel had dreams. She wanted to find love again, to build a stable future, maybe start a family of her own. She was the type of person who believed in second chances and new beginnings. She had been engaged before, to a man named Frank Catrapa, but that relationship had ended, leaving her to navigate the complicated emotions that come with starting over. In a town like Aliquippa, your business was everyone's business. People talked. They speculated. They watched. And sometimes, that attention could become dangerous. To understand what happened to Rachel Del Tonda, you have to understand the people in her orbit. Her story intersected with several individuals who would become central to the investigation that followed her death. First, there was Frank Catrapa, her former fiancé. Frank was someone Rachel had loved deeply, someone she had planned to marry. Their relationship had been serious, the kind that involved meeting each other's families, making future plans, talking about forever. But like many relationships, it had complications. Frank worked in the family business, and he had his own set of challenges and pressures. When their engagement ended, it left both of them trying to figure out how to move forward. In a small town, you can't simply disappear from someone's life. You see them at the grocery store, at local events, through mutual friends. The end of their relationship created a complex dynamic that would later draw scrutiny from investigators. Then there was Sheldon Jeter, a young man who had been Rachel's student when she was teaching. Sheldon had been a promising athlete, a football star at Aliquippa High School who had the kind of talent that made people pay attention. In a town where high school football was everything, Sheldon was somebody special. But Sheldon's relationship with Rachel had become complicated in ways that would later raise serious questions. What started as a teacher-student relationship had evolved into something that made people uncomfortable. There were whispers, speculation, and eventually, a police encounter that would become crucial to understanding the events that followed. The third key figure was Lauren Watkins, a young woman who had become close to Rachel. Lauren was the daughter of an Aliquippa police sergeant, which added another layer of complexity to an already intricate situation. She was someone Rachel trusted, someone she confided in, and someone who would be with her on the last night of her life. These relationships, with Frank, with Sheldon, with Lauren, created a web of connections that investigators would spend years trying to untangle. Each relationship had its own history, its own secrets, its own potential for jealousy and conflict. In the months before her death, Rachel Del Tonda found herself at the center of a scandal that would shake the small town of Aliquippa to its core. It was the kind of incident that, in a place where everyone knows everyone, becomes the subject of endless speculation and gossip. On a quiet evening, Aliquippa police officers were conducting routine patrols when they made a discovery that would have far-reaching consequences. They found Rachel Del Tonda's car parked in a location that seemed unusual. She was with Sheldon Jeter, her former student who was now a young man but still significantly younger than her 33 years. The police report from that night described a scene that raised immediate red flags. The car windows were steamed up, and Sheldon's seat was reclined. When officers approached the vehicle and asked what was going on, Rachel explained that she was counseling Sheldon, who she described as a former student who needed guidance. The officers weren't convinced by this explanation. The circumstances suggested something more intimate than a counseling session. However, after questioning both Rachel and Sheldon, the police drove Sheldon home and let the matter go, at least officially. But in a town like Aliquippa, nothing stays quiet for long. Word of the incident began to spread, creating a scandal that would follow Rachel for the rest of her life. The implications were serious. A former teacher found in a compromising situation with a much younger former student. It was the kind of story that people would talk about in hushed tones, that would damage reputations and raise questions about judgment and propriety. What made the situation even more complex was the fact that this wasn't just any young man, this was Sheldon Jeter, someone who had been a star athlete, someone people in town knew and followed. The revelation created shockwaves throughout the community. The incident also had professional implications for members of the Aliquippa Police Department. The fact that this information had been contained within a police report meant that it was supposed to remain confidential. But somehow, details began to leak out, suggesting that someone within the department was sharing information that should have stayed private. This leak would later become a major focus of the investigation, as authorities tried to determine who had access to this information and how it had become public knowledge. The breach of confidentiality would have serious consequences for several members of the police force and would add another layer of complexity to an already convoluted case. The leak of information about Rachel Del Tonda's encounter with Sheldon Jeter exposed serious problems within the Aliquippa Police Department. What should have remained a confidential police report had somehow become public knowledge, and the investigation into how this happened would reveal a web of corruption and misconduct that went far beyond one leaked document. The Aliquippa Police Department was a small force in a small town, the kind of place where officers knew everyone and everyone knew the officers. But this familiarity had bred a culture where professional boundaries became blurred and where personal relationships interfered with professional duties. Chief Donald Couch, who had been leading the department, found himself at the center of the scandal. The investigation revealed that the leak had come from someone with access to confidential police reports, and the finger-pointing began immediately. In a department where trust was essential, the revelation that someone was sharing sensitive information created an atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust. The situation became even more complicated when it was discovered that Assistant Chief Joe Percival had been involved in inappropriate communications with Lauren Watkins, the young woman who was both Rachel's friend and the daughter of a police sergeant. Percival was arrested on charges that he had shared an obscene text message with Lauren, who was a minor at the time. Percival claimed that the message had been sent by accident, that it was meant for someone else entirely. But the damage was done. The arrest of a high-ranking police official in a case that was already surrounded by controversy added another layer of scandal to an already complex situation. The problems within the police department went beyond individual cases of misconduct. They revealed a culture where professional standards had been compromised, where personal relationships interfered with official duties, and where confidential information was treated carelessly. Chief Couch eventually resigned in the wake of the scandal, leaving the department in turmoil. Assistant Chief Percival was arrested and removed from his position. The department, which was supposed to be investigating serious crimes and maintaining public safety, found itself under investigation by outside authorities. Robert Seelock eventually took over as the new chief, inheriting a department that had been severely damaged by scandal and controversy. The problems within the police force would continue to complicate the investigation into Rachel Del Tonda's murder, as questions arose about the competence and integrity of the officers who were supposed to be solving the case. The corruption within the Aliquippa Police Department wasn't just a side story to Rachel's murder, it was central to understanding the environment in which she lived and died. In a place where law enforcement couldn't be trusted, where confidential information was leaked, and where personal relationships compromised professional duties, seeking justice became infinitely more complicated. May 13, 2018, was Mother's Day, a day that should have been filled with celebration and family togetherness. For Rachel Del Tonda, it started like any other Sunday. She was at home with her parents, Lisa and Joe, in their house on Buchanan Street in Aliquippa. Rachel had been looking forward to a quiet evening with a friend. She had made plans to spend time with Lauren Watkins, the young woman who had become close to her despite their age difference. Lauren was someone Rachel trusted, someone she could talk to about the complicated situation she found herself in. The evening began innocently enough. Rachel and Lauren decided to go out for ice cream, a simple pleasure that would become heartbreakingly significant in the investigation that followed. They drove to a local ice cream shop, enjoying the warm spring evening and each other's company. After getting their ice cream, they visited a friend before eventually making their way back to Rachel's parents' house. It was around 9:20 in the evening when they arrived at the Del Tonda home. Rachel wanted to change clothes before continuing their evening together. The house on Buchanan Street was a modest home in a working-class neighborhood. It had a driveway that curved from the street to a side door, the kind of layout that was common in older residential areas. Rachel's parents were inside, probably watching television or preparing for the week ahead. Rachel went inside to change, leaving Lauren waiting in the car. It was a brief stop, just a few minutes to swap one outfit for another. When she came back out, she was wearing different clothes and ready to continue their evening. But something had changed in those few minutes. Maybe it was a phone call, maybe it was a text message, or maybe it was just a feeling that something wasn't right. Whatever it was, Rachel decided that she wanted to stay home for the night. She walked back to Lauren's car and told her friend that she had changed her mind about going out. She wanted to stay home with her parents, to have a quiet evening instead of continuing their plans. Lauren was understanding, these things happened, and there would be other nights to spend together. Lauren's car was parked in the driveway, and Rachel walked alongside it as her friend prepared to leave. They said their goodbyes, probably making plans for another time. It was a normal end to a normal evening between friends. Lauren backed out of the driveway and began to drive away, leaving Rachel standing at the foot of the driveway. In less than 4 minutes, everything would change forever. What happened in those 4 minutes after Lauren Watkins drove away from the Deltonda home has been the subject of intense investigation and speculation. The timeline is crucial to understanding how Rachel Deltonda's killer was able to strike so quickly and escape without being seen. Lauren later told investigators that she had driven straight home after leaving Rachel's house. She estimated that it took her about 4 minutes to make the drive to her own house. During that short drive, she had no idea that her friend was in danger. Meanwhile, Rachel was walking from where Lauren's car had been parked toward the side door of her parents' house. It should have been a simple walk of perhaps 30 or 40 feet, the kind of walk she had made thousands of times before. But she never made it to the door. The shooter appeared as if from nowhere. There were no witnesses to see where he came from or how he had positioned himself. He could have been hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. He could have followed Lauren's car and struck as soon as she drove away. Or he could have been watching the house, waiting for Rachel to be alone and vulnerable. The attack was swift and brutal. Rachel was shot multiple times, the sound of gunfire shattering the quiet Mother's Day evening. The shooter used a handgun, firing several rounds at close range. The attack was clearly intended to kill. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a random act of violence. After the shooting, the gunman disappeared into the night. He left no witnesses, no clear evidence, and no obvious clues about his identity or his escape route. In a matter of seconds, he had committed murder and vanished. Inside the house, Rachel's parents heard the gunshots. The sound of gunfire in their own driveway was unmistakable and terrifying. They rushed outside to find their daughter lying at the foot of the driveway, gravely wounded. The emergency call went out immediately, bringing police and paramedics to the scene. But it was too late. Rachel Deltonda, the beloved teacher who had been trying to rebuild her life, was dead at the age of 33. The scene that greeted investigators was both heartbreaking and puzzling. Rachel's body was found not near the side door of the house, where she had been walking, but all the way at the foot of the driveway. This suggested that either the shooter had confronted her there, or that she had tried to run and been caught before she could escape. The positioning of the body would become an important piece of evidence in the investigation that followed. It suggested that the killer had either been waiting at the end of the driveway or had chased Rachel down as she tried to flee. The murder of Rachel Deltonda sent shockwaves through the small community of Aliquippa. This wasn't the kind of crime that happened in their neighborhood, an execution-style killing in a residential driveway on Mother's Day. The brutality and apparent premeditation of the attack suggested that this was personal, that someone had specifically targeted Rachel. The Aliquippa Police Department, already reeling from the corruption scandal that had engulfed the force, found themselves investigating one of the most high-profile cases in the town's history. But the same problems that had plagued the department, questions about competence, integrity, and professionalism, would continue to complicate the investigation. The Pennsylvania State Police were called in to assist with the investigation, bringing additional resources and expertise to what was clearly a complex case. The involvement of state investigators was both necessary and telling. It suggested that local authorities either couldn't or wouldn't handle the case on their own. From the beginning, investigators faced significant challenges. There were no eyewitnesses to the shooting itself. The attack had happened quickly, under cover of darkness, in a residential area where most people were inside their homes. The killer had chosen his moment carefully, striking when Rachel was alone and vulnerable. The physical evidence was limited. The shooter had used a handgun, but the weapon was never recovered. Shell casings were found at the scene, but without the gun, ballistics analysis could only tell investigators so much. There were no fingerprints, no DNA evidence, and no clear signs of how the killer had approached or escaped. The investigation quickly focused on the people in Rachel's life, her family, friends, ex-boyfriends, and acquaintances. In a case like this, where the victim appeared to have been specifically targeted, the killer was likely someone who knew her personally. Frank Catrapa, Rachel's former fiancé, was among the first people questioned by investigators. The end of their engagement had been difficult, and in cases of domestic violence, former intimate partners are always considered potential suspects. Frank cooperated with the investigation, providing alibis and answering questions about his relationship with Rachel. Sheldon Jeter, the young man who had been found with Rachel in the car months earlier, also became a focus of the investigation. His relationship with Rachel had been the subject of scandal and speculation, and investigators wanted to understand the exact nature of their connection. Lauren Watkins, who had been with Rachel on the night of the murder, was interviewed extensively. As the last person to see Rachel alive, her testimony about the events of that evening would be crucial to understanding what had happened. The investigation also looked into the broader context of Rachel's life. Had she been receiving threats? Was she afraid of someone? Had she mentioned feeling unsafe or being followed? These questions would lead investigators into the complex web of relationships and secrets that had surrounded Rachel in the months before her death. As the investigation into Rachel Deltonda's murder progressed, several theories began to emerge about who might have killed her and why. Each theory was based on different aspects of her life and the complex relationships that had surrounded her. The first theory focused on Frank Catrapa, her former fiancé. Domestic violence cases often involve former intimate partners, and the end of their engagement had been difficult for both of them. Some investigators wondered if Frank had been unable to accept the end of their relationship, if he had become obsessed with Rachel or jealous of her attempts to move on with her life. Frank consistently denied any involvement in Rachel's murder. He provided alibis for the night of the killing and cooperated with investigators. But in a case where the victim had been specifically targeted, former romantic partners always remain under scrutiny. The second theory centered on Sheldon Jeter, the young man who had been found with Rachel in the car months earlier. This theory suggested that Sheldon had become obsessed with Rachel, that their relationship had been more than just teacher-student counseling, and that he had killed her when she tried to distance herself from him. Over time, this theory gained traction with investigators. Beaver County District Attorney David Lozier eventually named Sheldon Jeter as the prime suspect in Rachel's murder, stating that GPS and surveillance footage suggested Jeter had a pattern of stalking Rachel. The evidence against Sheldon was largely circumstantial, but it painted a disturbing picture. Phone records and GPS data suggested that he had been tracking Rachel's movements, that he knew where she was and when she was there. Surveillance footage from various locations showed him in areas where Rachel had been, suggesting a pattern of following her. Investigators believed that the shooter either followed Rachel, or was lying in wait, and that Sheldon had killed her because Rachel had moved on from Jeter. The third theory involved the corruption within the Aliquippa Police Department and the leak of confidential information about Rachel's encounter with Sheldon. This theory suggested that someone within the police force, or someone connected to the department, had killed Rachel to prevent her from revealing what she knew about the corruption. This theory was more complex and speculative, but it couldn't be dismissed entirely. Rachel had been at the center of a scandal that had exposed serious problems within the police department. If she had been planning to reveal additional information or if she had been pressuring someone to come forward, she might have been seen as a threat. The investigation also looked into the possibility that Rachel's murder was connected to other crimes in the area. The night Rachel was killed, there were already 8 unsolved murders in the city of Aliquippa, Pennsylvania. This suggested that the town had serious problems with violence and crime, and that Rachel's murder might have been part of a larger pattern. As investigators worked to build a case, they faced the challenge of limited physical evidence and the lack of eyewitnesses. The case would ultimately depend on circumstantial evidence, witness testimony, and the ability to establish motive and opportunity. More than 6 years after Rachel Del Tonda was gunned down in her parents' driveway, her murder remains officially unsolved. Despite extensive investigation, multiple suspects, and numerous theories, no one has been arrested or charged in connection with her death. While Beaver County District Attorney David Lozier has named Sheldon Jeter as the prime suspect, the case has not moved forward to prosecution. The challenges that investigators faced from the beginning, the lack of eyewitnesses, limited physical evidence, and the complex web of relationships surrounding Rachel, have continued to complicate efforts to bring her killer to justice. Sheldon Jeter, the prime suspect in Rachel's murder, was later convicted of killing his friend Tyrek Pugh in an unrelated case. Jeter was sentenced to life in that case, but a hearing on alleged juror misconduct is pending. His conviction in another murder case has raised questions about whether he was also responsible for Rachel's death, but it has not led to charges in her case. The Del Tonda family continues to seek answers about what happened to their daughter. After the district attorney named Sheldon Jeter as the prime suspect, Rachel's parents, Lisa and Joseph Del Tonda, issued a statement expressing their continued hope for justice. The case has exposed the deep problems within the Aliquippa community, the corruption in law enforcement, the culture of secrets and silence, and the way that personal relationships can become dangerously entangled with professional responsibilities. It has also highlighted the challenges that investigators face when trying to solve complex cases in small towns where everyone knows everyone else. For the people of Aliquippa, Rachel Del Tonda's murder remains a tragic reminder of how quickly life can change, how secrets can destroy lives, and how the search for justice can be complicated by the very institutions that are supposed to provide it. Rachel Del Tonda was a teacher who wanted to help young people build better lives. She was a daughter who was trying to rebuild her relationship with her parents. She was a woman who believed in second chances and new beginnings. Her story is a reminder that behind every true crime case is a real person with hopes, dreams, and people who loved them. As we close this story tonight, we remember Rachel not just as a victim of a senseless crime, but as a person who lived fully and loved deeply. Her case remains open, and somewhere out there, someone knows what really happened on that Mother's Day evening in 2018. The truth has a way of emerging, even when it takes years. For Rachel Del Tonda, for her family, and for the community that continues to seek answers, the hope for justice remains alive. Thank you for listening to tonight's True Crime Stories. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next True Crime Stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.